The birth of a chosen people. Before Israel had a king, before Jerusalem became its capital, before the temple stood on Mount Zion, and long before Assyrian and Babylonian armies marched against its cities, Israel was not yet a nation. It was a family, and that family began with a promise so enormous that from a human point of view, it seemed almost impossible. The history of Israel would eventually pass through slavery, wilderness, conquest, civil conflict, monarchy, division, invasion, and exile. Its kings would build palaces and temples. Its prophets would confront rulers and warn entire generations. Its armies would win astonishing victories and suffer devastating defeats. Yet none of that explains Israel's beginning. To understand why this nation existed at all, we have to go back centuries before Moses, centuries before David, to a man living in the ancient Near Eastern world whose life was interrupted by a divine call. His name was Abram. The book of Genesis introduces Abram as a descendant of Shem through the family line of Terah. His family had connections with Ur of the Chaldeans, and Terah eventually traveled with Abram's wife Sarai and his grandson Lot toward the land of Canaan, but they stopped in Haran. It was there that Abram's story became something much larger than the story of one household. The Lord called him to leave his country, his relatives, and his father's household, and go to a land that would be shown to him. Attached to that command was a series of promises. Abram would become a great nation. His name would become great. He would be blessed, and through him, blessing would extend far beyond his own descendants. This is one of the foundation stones of Israel's history. Israel did not begin with a military conquest. It did not begin with a political revolution. It did not begin because a powerful tribe seized territory and declared itself a kingdom. It began with a covenant promise. Abram entered Canaan and traveled through the land, reaching places that would later become deeply important in Israel's story. Shechem, the hill country near Bethel, and the southern regions of Canaan. But almost immediately, the promise faced a contradiction. God had spoken about descendants. Abram and Sarai had no children. God had spoken about land. Abram lived in that land as a sojourner. God had spoken about blessing. Yet famine soon forced Abram to leave Canaan temporarily and go down into Egypt. This pattern would become familiar throughout Israel's history. Promise followed by testing, calling followed by uncertainty, divine faithfulness existing alongside very real human failure. Abram himself was not presented as flawless. During the crisis in Egypt, he feared that Sarai's beauty would place his life in danger. He asked her to identify herself as his sister, placing both her and the promise in a precarious position. Genesis does not hide the weaknesses of the people through whom its story moves. That matters. Israel's history would never be the history of perfect human beings successfully carrying out a perfect plan. Again and again, the biblical narrative would show something more uncomfortable and more profound, God's purposes continuing through people whose fear, impatience, ambition, and disobedience repeatedly endangered what they had been given. Abram returned to Canaan. His possessions increased, as did those of his nephew Lot, until the land could no longer easily support both households together. Conflict developed between their herdsmen, and Abram proposed separation. Lot chose the fertile Jordan Valley and moved toward the cities of the plain, eventually becoming associated with Sodom. Abram remained in Canaan. Again, the promise of the land was repeated. Abram was told to look north, south, east, and west. The land before him would belong to his descendants. But there was still a problem. There were no descendants. Years passed. Abram had wealth. He had servants. He had influence. He was capable of gathering armed men from his household to rescue Lot after a coalition of eastern kings carried him away. But the one thing necessary for the promise of a future nation remained absent: a son. Genesis presents Abram wrestling openly with this tension. What could the promise mean if his household eventually passed to a servant? The divine answer was direct. Abram's heir would come from his own body. Then came one of the most important images in the patriarchal story. Abram was brought outside and told to look toward the heavens and count the stars if he could. So would his descendants be. Abram believed the Lord. Yet faith did not prevent later impatience. Sarai remained unable to bear children, and she proposed a solution consistent with certain ancient household practices. Abram could father a child through her Egyptian servant, Hagar. Abram agreed. Hagar conceived Ishmael. The consequences were immediate. Tension entered the household. Sarai and Hagar came into conflict. Hagar fled, then returned after encountering the Lord's direction in the wilderness. Ishmael was born. For years, Abram may have assumed that this was how the promise would continue, but the covenant would take another path. Abram's name was changed to Abraham. Sarai became Sarah, and God declared that Sarah herself would bear a son. The promise was not simply that Abraham would have descendants somehow. The covenant line would continue through the son born to Abraham and Sarah. His name would be Isaac. The announcement seemed beyond ordinary possibility. Abraham was advanced in age, and Sarah was long past the normal years of childbearing. Yet Isaac was born. His name, associated with laughter, carried the memory of the astonishment surrounding his birth. With Isaac, the family that would become Israel entered its second generation. But the biblical story immediately makes something clear. Biological descent from Abraham alone did not mean that every branch of his family would play the same role in the covenant story. Ishmael was not forgotten. Genesis describes promises concerning his descendants and his future. But the covenant line continued through Isaac. Later, Abraham faced one of the most severe tests in his entire life when he was commanded to offer Isaac. The narrative is deliberately tense. The son through whom the promises were supposed to continue appeared to be placed in direct conflict with the command Abraham had received. Abraham traveled to the region of Moriah with Isaac. An altar was prepared, wood was arranged, and at the decisive moment, Abraham was stopped. A ram was provided. Isaac lived. The covenant line continued. For Israel's later generations, the story carried a lesson that would echo through Scripture. The promise depended finally on the faithfulness and provision of God, not merely on human control of circumstances. Abraham's life eventually ended, but the promise moved forward through Isaac. Isaac's story is quieter than Abraham's and less dramatic than that of his son Jacob. Yet he formed the essential bridge between them. Isaac married Rebekah. For a time, they too faced childlessness. Then Rebekah conceived twins. Even before their birth, conflict seemed to define them. The two children struggled within her, and Rebekah was told that two nations were in her womb, two peoples who would be divided, with the older serving the younger. The first child was Esau. The second was Jacob. Jacob emerged grasping Esau's heel, an image that fit the rivalry that would shape their lives. Esau became a skilled hunter, a man of the open country. Jacob was more closely associated with the tents and household. Their parents developed different attachments. Isaac favored Esau, while Rebekah favored Jacob. The family was already divided before the question of inheritance reached its climax. One day, Esau returned from the field exhausted and found Jacob preparing food. Esau wanted the meal. Jacob demanded Esau's birthright in exchange. Esau agreed. Later came an even more serious conflict involving Isaac's blessing. When Isaac was old and his eyesight had weakened, he intended to bless Esau. Rebekah overheard. She arranged for Jacob to appear before his father disguised as his brother. Jacob wore Esau's clothing. The skins of young goats were placed on his hands and neck to imitate Esau's hairiness. Isaac was suspicious. The voice sounded like Jacob, but the clothing smelled like Esau, and the hands seemed to confirm the deception. Isaac gave Jacob the blessing. When Esau returned and the truth emerged, the family exploded. Esau pleaded for another blessing. His grief turned toward anger. Jacob had gained what he wanted, but he could no longer remain safely at home. He fled. This is the man through whom Israel would receive its name. Not a triumphant warrior, not yet a righteous patriarch standing confidently before nations. A fugitive running from the consequences of deception. Jacob traveled toward Haran, the region associated with his mother's family. On the way, he stopped for the night. With a stone near his head, he slept beneath the open sky. And there, Genesis describes a dream. Jacob saw something like a stairway or ramp extending between earth and heaven, with divine messengers ascending and descending. The Lord reaffirmed to Jacob the promises associated with Abraham and Isaac land descendants' blessing and divine presence. Jacob woke with awe. The fugitive had discovered that the covenant had followed him into exile. But Jacob's character would not change overnight. In Haran, he entered the household of his uncle Laban, and the deceiver soon experienced deception himself. Jacob loved Laban's younger daughter Rachel and agreed to work 7 years for her. But after the wedding celebration, Jacob discovered that Laban had given him Leah, the older sister. Jacob then married Rachel as well, committing himself to further years of service. What followed was a complicated household marked by love, rivalry, grief, competition, and the desperate desire for children. Leah bore sons. Rachel initially remained barren. Their servants, Bilhah and Zilpah, were also drawn into the struggle for descendants. From this fractured family came the sons who would become associated with the tribes of Israel: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Issachar, Zebulun, Joseph, and later Benjamin. Israel began not as a simple, peaceful household, but as a family filled with complicated relationships whose consequences would continue for generations. Eventually, Jacob left Laban and began the journey back toward Canaan. But returning home meant facing something he had avoided for years: Esau. Jacob heard that Esau was approaching with 400 men. Fear seized him. He divided his camp. He sent gifts ahead. He prepared for the possibility of disaster. Then, during the night before the meeting, Jacob found himself alone. Genesis describes a mysterious encounter in which Jacob wrestled with a man until daybreak. Jacob refused to release him without receiving a blessing. He left the encounter wounded, walking with a limp. But he also left with a new name: Israel. The meaning of the name is connected in the narrative with Jacob's struggle with God and with men. From this moment forward, the biblical story could speak not only of Jacob the man, but of Israel the patriarch, whose descendants would carry his name. The next day, Jacob met Esau. Instead of the massacre he feared, there was reconciliation. Esau ran to meet him, embraced him, and the brothers wept. The danger passed. Yet the family's future was far from secure. Jacob settled again in Canaan, where his sons grew into men, and among those sons, one became the center of a new crisis: Joseph. Joseph was the son of Rachel, the woman Jacob had deeply loved. Genesis tells us that Jacob loved Joseph more than his other sons and gave him a distinctive garment. Whatever its precise appearance, the garment publicly marked Joseph's favored status. The brothers noticed. Resentment grew. Then Joseph began reporting dreams. In one dream, the brothers' sheaves bowed before his sheaf. In another, the sun, moon, and 11 stars bowed before him. His brothers understood the implication. Would Joseph rule over them? Would they bow before their younger brother? The dreams intensified their hatred. The family through which nations were supposed to be blessed was now being poisoned from within, by favoritism, jealousy, and rivalry. One day, Jacob sent Joseph to check on his brothers while they were tending the flocks. They saw him coming from a distance. Before he reached them, some began discussing killing him. Reuben intervened, hoping to rescue Joseph later, and Joseph was instead thrown into a pit. Then Judah proposed another course. Rather than kill their brother, they could sell him. A passing caravan offered the opportunity. Joseph was taken from the pit, he was sold, and he was carried away toward Egypt. The brothers took Joseph's garment, stained it with the blood of a goat, and presented it to Jacob. Jacob recognized it. He concluded that a wild animal had killed his son. His grief was overwhelming. Meanwhile, Joseph arrived in Egypt, where he was sold into the household of Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh. At this moment, the promise to Abraham seemed to be moving in two opposite directions. The covenant family remained in Canaan, but one of its sons had been carried into Egypt as a slave. Nothing about this looked like the beginning of national deliverance. Yet the disaster inside Jacob's family would become the mechanism by which that family survived. Joseph gained responsibility in Potiphar's household, but after refusing the advances of Potiphar's wife, he was falsely accused and imprisoned. Even there, his ability and character brought him responsibility. Years passed. Joseph interpreted dreams for two of Pharaoh's officials. One was restored to service, but Joseph remained forgotten. Then Pharaoh himself dreamed. He saw 7 healthy cows swallowed by 7 gaunt cows. He saw 7 good heads of grain swallowed by 7 thin, scorched heads. Egypt's wise men could not satisfy Pharaoh with an interpretation. Only then did the restored official remember the Hebrew prisoner. Joseph was brought before Pharaoh. He did not claim the ability for himself. The interpretation, he said, belonged to God. Egypt would experience 7 years of extraordinary abundance, followed by 7 years of severe famine. Joseph advised Pharaoh to prepare. Pharaoh responded by placing Joseph over the very system he had proposed. The rejected brother, the foreign slave, the forgotten prisoner, now stood near the center of Egyptian power. The famine eventually reached Canaan. Jacob heard that grain was available in Egypt and sent his sons south to buy food. They entered Joseph's presence, and they bowed. They did not recognize him, but Joseph recognized them. The dreams of his youth had returned, not as adolescent boasting, but as reality. What followed was a long and emotionally charged testing of the brothers. Benjamin, Joseph's full brother, was eventually brought to Egypt. Judah, the same brother who had once proposed selling Joseph, offered himself in place of Benjamin when it appeared that Benjamin would be enslaved. Something had changed. Joseph could no longer restrain himself. He revealed his identity. The brothers were terrified. The man they had sold now held power over their lives. But Joseph interpreted the history differently. They had intended evil, yet God had used the event to preserve life. This did not excuse what they had done. It revealed that their sin had not been powerful enough to destroy the larger purpose moving through the family. Jacob learned that Joseph was alive. The old patriarch who had mourned him for years prepared to leave Canaan and travel to Egypt. This was no small transition. The land of Canaan was the land connected with the covenant promise. Egypt was foreign territory, but famine had made survival impossible without moving. Jacob descended into Egypt with his household. There, father and son were reunited. Joseph settled his family in the region of Goshen. They survived the famine. They increased. And when Jacob approached death, he gathered his sons and spoke over their futures. His words looked beyond individual personalities toward the tribes that would emerge from them. Particular attention fell on Judah. Kingship would later become associated with his line. Joseph's sons Ephraim and Manasseh were also incorporated into the family inheritance in a special way, becoming tribal ancestors in Israel's later structure. Jacob died in Egypt, but his body was carried back to Canaan for burial. Joseph also eventually died. Before his death, however, he expressed confidence that God would one day bring the descendants of Israel out of Egypt and back toward the land promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He gave instructions concerning his bones. Joseph died in Egypt. The family remained there, and this is where the first great movement in Israel's history closes. Abraham had entered Canaan as one man, carrying a promise. Isaac had inherited it. Jacob had carried it through conflict, exile, and return. Jacob became Israel. His sons became the fathers of tribes. And through Joseph, the entire household had been preserved from famine. But survival came with a hidden cost. Israel's descendants were now living outside the promised land. They were guests in Egypt, protected because of Joseph's position and remembered because of what he had done. For the moment, Egypt was a place of refuge. But political memory does not last forever. Kings die, dynasties change, generations forget. And the family that entered Egypt seeking bread would not remain a welcomed family forever. They would multiply. They would become numerous, and one day a new Pharaoh would look at them not as the relatives of a national hero, but as a threat. The family born from a promise was about to become an enslaved people, and from that slavery, the nation of Israel would truly begin. From slavery to covenant nation. Egypt had once saved the family of Israel. Now Egypt became the place where that family was nearly crushed. Generations passed after the death of Joseph. The descendants of Jacob multiplied in the land. What had entered Egypt as a relatively small household grew into a numerous people. Then the political world changed. Exodus introduces a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. Whether this means he had literally never heard of Joseph or that Joseph's former service no longer carried political weight, the result was the same. Pharaoh looked at the Israelites and saw danger. They were becoming too numerous. In the imagination of Egypt's ruler, their population was no longer a blessing to the land, but a potential military threat. If war came, he feared they might join Egypt's enemies and escape. So Egypt attempted to control them. The Israelites were placed under forced labor. Taskmasters oppressed them. They were compelled to build storage cities for Pharaoh. Their lives became bitter, with hard service in brick and mortar and with labor in the fields. But oppression did not produce the result Pharaoh wanted. The more Israel was afflicted, the more the people multiplied. Fear intensified. The state moved from exploitation toward attempted destruction. Pharaoh ordered the Hebrew midwives to kill newborn boys. But the midwives feared God and did not obey the king's command. Then Pharaoh broadened the order. Every Hebrew son was to be thrown into the Nile. The river that sustained Egypt's civilization became in Pharaoh's decree an instrument of death. And into that world a child was born from the tribe of Levi. His mother hid him as long as she could. When hiding him became impossible, she placed him in a small basket, coated to keep out the water, and set it among the reeds along the Nile. The child's sister watched from a distance. Then Pharaoh's own daughter found him. She recognized that he was one of the Hebrew children, yet she had compassion. The child who should have died under Pharaoh's command entered Pharaoh's household under the protection of Pharaoh's daughter. His name was Moses. The irony is difficult to miss. The ruler who was trying to destroy Israel's sons unknowingly allowed one of them to be raised within the world of Egyptian royalty. Moses grew between identities. He was Hebrew by birth. He was connected to the royal household of Egypt by upbringing, and one day that divided identity reached a crisis. Moses went out and saw the forced labor of his own people. He witnessed an Egyptian beating a Hebrew. Looking around and seeing no one, Moses killed the Egyptian and hid the body in the sand. The next day he encountered two Hebrews fighting and challenged the one who was in the wrong. The response exposed him. "Who made you ruler and judge over us?" The man knew what Moses had done. Soon Pharaoh knew as well. Moses fled Egypt. The man who might once have seemed uniquely positioned to help Israel was now a fugitive. He escaped eastward into the land of Midian. There, beside a well, Moses defended a group of women from shepherds who were driving them away. He was welcomed into the household of their father, later identified as Jethro, the priest of Midian. Moses married Zipporah. He became a shepherd. Years passed. The palaces of Egypt were behind him. The suffering of Israel continued without him. From a human perspective, Moses' opportunity had disappeared. But the deliverance of Israel was never going to begin with Moses forcing history forward through violence. It would begin with a call. One day, while Moses was tending the flock near Horeb, the mountain of God, he saw something extraordinary. A bush was burning, but it was not being consumed. Moses turned aside. Then God called to him from the bush. "Moses, Moses," he answered. He was told not to come closer and to remove his sandals because the ground was holy. Then came words that connected Moses directly with the story of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The God speaking to him identified himself as the God of his fathers, and he declared that he had seen the suffering of his people in Egypt. He had heard their cries, he knew their pain, and he had come down to deliver them. But Moses would be sent to Pharaoh. The fugitive shepherd would return to the empire he had escaped. His task was simple to state and terrifying to imagine. Bring Israel out of Egypt. Moses resisted. Who was he to go to Pharaoh? What if Israel asked for the name of the God who had sent him? What if they did not believe him? Moses repeatedly raised objections. He was given signs. His staff became a serpent and returned to a staff. His hand became diseased and was restored. God revealed his covenant name to Moses in a profound declaration, often rendered in English as, "I am who I am." Moses was to tell Israel that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob had sent him. Still, Moses hesitated, pointing to his difficulty in speaking. His brother Aaron would assist him. But the calling remained Moses' own. The shepherd had run from Egypt as a murderer. He would return as the servant through whom God confronted Pharaoh. When Moses and Aaron came before the elders of Israel and demonstrated the signs the people initially believed, they bowed in worship when they heard that the Lord had seen their suffering. Then Moses and Aaron appeared before Pharaoh. Their request was presented in the name of the God of Israel. Pharaoh's answer established the central conflict of the Exodus. Who is the Lord that I should obey his voice? Pharaoh did not merely refuse a labor request, he challenged the authority behind it. He would not let Israel go. Instead, he increased their suffering. The Israelites had been required to make bricks. Now they were ordered to gather their own straw while maintaining the same production quota. The foremen were beaten when the quota was not met. The people turned against Moses and Aaron. Deliverance had been announced. Life had become worse. Moses himself cried out to God in confusion. Why had he been sent if Pharaoh's oppression only intensified? This is one of the recurring patterns in the Exodus story. God's promise of deliverance did not mean Pharaoh surrendered immediately. The confrontation exposed just how tightly Egypt intended to hold Israel. Then the struggle escalated. Moses and Aaron returned to Pharaoh. The signs began. The Nile turned to blood. The river Egypt depended upon became undrinkable. Fish died. The land smelled of death. Yet Pharaoh's heart remained resistant. Then frogs spread across the land. They entered houses, bedrooms, ovens, and kneading bowls. Pharaoh asked for relief, but when the pressure lifted, he refused to release the people. Then came gnats. Then flies. The conflict deepened. A severe plague struck Egyptian livestock. Then painful boils afflicted people and animals. Hail devastated crops and shattered what stood exposed in the fields. Pharaoh sometimes appeared to yield under pressure. He even acknowledged wrongdoing. But once relief came, resistance returned. Locusts followed, consuming what the hail had left. Then darkness covered Egypt. For 3 days, a darkness described as tangible lay across the land, while the Israelites had light where they lived. The plagues were not random spectacles. Within the narrative, they progressively dismantled Pharaoh's claim to control. Egypt's ruler could command Israel. He could increase labor. He could order the deaths of children, but he could not command the river, the weather, the insects, the darkness, or the God Moses represented. Still, Pharaoh refused, and the final judgment would be more terrible than everything before it. Moses announced the death of the firstborn throughout Egypt. But Israel was given specific instructions. Each household was to take a lamb. Its blood was to be placed on the doorposts and lintel of the house. The people were to eat the meal prepared for departure, sandals on their feet, staff in hand, ready to leave. This night would become foundational to Israel's identity, Passover. The judgment came. Across Egypt the firstborn died. From Pharaoh's household to the household of the servant, grief filled the land. But the Israelite houses, marked according to the command, were passed over. The king who had once ordered Hebrew sons to die now suffered loss within his own nation and household. Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron during the night. Israel was to leave. Not slowly, not after negotiations, immediately. The Egyptians urged them to go. After generations of forced labor, the people of Israel walked out of Egypt. The descendants of Jacob were no longer simply surviving inside a foreign empire. They were moving toward freedom. But Pharaoh's surrender did not last. Soon he regretted letting them go. Egyptian chariots pursued the Israelites. The newly freed people found themselves trapped between Pharaoh's army and the sea. Panic spread through the camp. Had Moses brought them into the wilderness to die? Would it not have been better that they asked to remain slaves in Egypt? Freedom had lasted only long enough for them to discover how frightening freedom could be. Then came the defining event. Moses stretched out his hand over the sea. A strong wind drove the waters back. Israel crossed on dry ground. Egyptian forces followed. When Israel reached the other side, the waters returned. The army that represented Egypt's power was overwhelmed. The threat behind them disappeared beneath the sea. Israel stood alive on the opposite shore. For generations afterward, Israel would look back to this event as one of the central demonstrations of God's saving power. The Exodus was not merely a successful escape from slavery. It became part of Israel's answer to the question, "Who are we?" They were the people whom the Lord had brought out of Egypt. Moses and the Israelites sang. Miriam, Moses' sister, led women with tambourines. The language of slavery gave way, at least for a moment, to the language of victory. But leaving Egypt was not the same thing as becoming a faithful nation. The sea had separated Israel from Pharaoh. It had not removed fear, impatience, or distrust from Israel's heart. The wilderness exposed that almost immediately. The people encountered bitter water and complained. They feared hunger and remembered Egypt, selectively speaking, as though slavery had provided security they now lacked. God provided manna food, appearing with the morning dew. They were instructed to gather enough for each day, with special provision before the Sabbath. They complained about water again. At Rephidim, Moses struck the rock as instructed, and water came out. Then Amalek attacked Israel. Joshua appears in the narrative as a military leader, while Moses stood overlooking the battle with the staff of God in his hand. When Moses' hands grew tired, Aaron and Hur supported them. Israel prevailed. The former slaves were beginning to experience life not merely as refugees escaping Egypt, but as a people moving toward a common destiny. Then they reached Mount Sinai. This was the moment that transformed the meaning of their freedom. Israel had not been delivered simply so that no one would rule them. They had been delivered to enter covenant with the God who had rescued them. Moses went up the mountain. The Lord reminded Israel of what had already happened. They had seen what had been done to Egypt. They had been carried, figuratively, on eagle's wings and brought to God. Now came the covenant calling. If Israel obeyed and kept the covenant, they would be a treasured possession among the nations, a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. Those words defined a purpose much larger than political independence. Israel was not simply another ancient people with its own territory and ruler. Its national identity was tied to covenant. The people agreed. They would do what the Lord commanded. The mountain was prepared. Boundaries were established. Thunder sounded, lightning flashed, a thick cloud covered Sinai. The sound of a trumpet grew increasingly loud. The people trembled. At the center of the covenant stood commandments that ordered Israel's relationship with God and with one another. They were to have no other gods before the Lord. They were not to make idols for worship. They were not to misuse the divine name. They were to remember the Sabbath. They were to honor father and mother. They were forbidden from murder, adultery, theft, false testimony, and coveting what belonged to another. These commandments did not appear in a vacuum. They came after deliverance. The Lord first identified himself as the one who had brought Israel out of Egypt, out of slavery. Then came the requirements of covenant life. Freedom from Pharaoh did not mean freedom from moral responsibility. The law expanded beyond these central commandments into instructions governing worship, justice, property restitution, social responsibility, and the shape of Israel's communal life. For modern readers, some of these laws belong to a social world very different from our own. But within the biblical story, their purpose is clear. Israel was being formed into a distinct covenant community. The nation needed more than memories of rescue. It needed a way to live. The covenant was formally confirmed. Sacrifices were offered. Blood was associated with the covenant ceremony. Moses read the book of the covenant before the people. Again, they pledged obedience. Then Moses went up the mountain for an extended period. Instructions were given for the tabernacle, a portable sanctuary that would stand at the center of Israel's camp. Its importance cannot be reduced to its furniture or dimensions. The theological question behind the tabernacle was far greater. How could a holy God dwell among the people who had already demonstrated fear, complaint, and weakness? The tabernacle represented divine presence in the midst of Israel. The Ark of the Covenant would occupy the most sacred space. Priests would serve. Sacrifices would become part of Israel's covenant worship. The camp was being organized around the presence of God. Yet, while Moses remained on the mountain receiving instructions about worship, Israel was already breaking the covenant below. The people became impatient. They did not know what had happened to Moses. They approached Aaron and demanded gods who would go before them. Aaron collected gold. A calf was fashioned. The people declared that this represented the god or gods who had brought them out of Egypt. A festival followed. The contradiction was staggering. The nation had heard the command against idolatry. The covenant had barely begun, and Israel had already violated its heart. God told Moses what was happening. Moses descended with the tablets of the covenant. When he saw the calf and the celebration, he threw the tablets from his hands and shattered them at the foot of the mountain. The broken tablets became a visible picture of a broken covenant. The golden calf was destroyed. Judgment followed. And Moses stood in the terrifying space between divine judgment and the people's survival. He interceded. The crisis raised a question that would follow Israel for centuries. How could the nation survive if its very identity depended on a covenant it repeatedly violated? Moses pleaded for God's continued presence. He understood that Canaan, without the Lord, would not fulfill Israel's calling. The land itself was not enough. What distinguished Israel was not merely geography. It was the presence and covenant of God. The covenant was renewed. New tablets were prepared. The tabernacle was eventually constructed according to the instructions Moses had received. Its structure, curtains, altar, lampstand, priestly garments, and sacred spaces all contributed to a system of worship that taught Israel about holiness, sacrifice, mediation, and access to God. When the work was completed, the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. The same God who had confronted Pharaoh now dwelt symbolically in the midst of the people he had delivered. Egypt was behind them. The covenant stood before them. For the first time, the descendants of Jacob possessed the defining structures of national identity. They had a shared history. They had a leader. They had covenant law. They had priests. They had worship. They had tribal organization. They had the promise of a land. And at the center of the camp stood the tabernacle. But there was one thing they still did not possess: Canaan itself. The promise to Abraham had not yet been completed. Israel was free, but still in the wilderness. The next stage required something different from escaping Pharaoh. It required trust. The people would have to move toward a land already occupied by fortified cities and powerful inhabitants. They would have to believe that the God who defeated Egypt could also bring them into Canaan. So Israel left Sinai and moved north. The journey should have been a transition from covenant to inheritance. Instead, complaint followed complaint. At times, the people spoke as if Egypt had been better. Moses himself felt overwhelmed by the burden of leadership. Then Israel approached the wilderness of Paran, and scouts were sent into Canaan. 12 men went to examine the land. Among them were Joshua from the tribe of Ephraim and Caleb from Judah. For 40 days they explored Canaan. When they returned, they brought evidence of the land's abundance. It truly was fruitful. But 10 of the scouts focused on something else. The inhabitants were powerful. The cities were fortified. The challenge appeared enormous. Joshua and Caleb urged Israel to trust the Lord and move forward. The others spread fear. The fear became contagious. That night the camp erupted in grief. The people wept. They complained against Moses and Aaron. Some proposed choosing another leader and returning to Egypt. At the very edge of the promise, the generation that had walked through the sea wanted to go back to the nation that had enslaved them. This was no longer ordinary anxiety. It was a rejection of the path God had set before them. The judgment was severe. The generation that refused to enter would not receive the land. Israel would wander in the wilderness. Their children would enter Canaan instead. The people who had seen Egypt's plagues, crossed the sea, eaten manna, stood at Sinai, and watched the tabernacle filled with glory, would spend the remainder of their lives outside the inheritance they had feared to receive. Only Joshua and Caleb from that scouting generation would enter the land. The Exodus generation had been delivered from slavery in a single night, but a slave mentality distrust, and rebellion could not be removed by crossing one body of water. Israel now faced years in the wilderness. One generation would fade, another would rise. Moses would continue to lead them, but even Moses would eventually face a failure with consequences of his own. And when Israel finally stood again on the border of Canaan, the man who had confronted Pharaoh would not be the man who led them across. The nation had escaped Egypt. Now it had to survive itself. Wilderness conquest and an unfinished inheritance. Israel had escaped Egypt, but escaping Egypt was only the beginning. The generation that had seen Pharaoh defeated now faced a sentence of its own. Because of its refusal to trust God at the border of Canaan, that generation would wander in the wilderness until it passed away. The promise remained, but those who had feared the land would not inherit it. For years, Israel moved through a landscape that became both a place of provision and a place of exposure. The wilderness stripped away every illusion of control. There were no Egyptian storehouses to depend upon, no permanent fields, no fortified cities of their own, no established kingdom. They lived by daily dependence. Manna continued to appear. Water had to be provided. The tabernacle remained at the center of the camp. The cloud that represented God's presence guided their movements. But the wilderness also revealed how deeply rebellion could survive inside a people who had already experienced extraordinary deliverance. One of the most dramatic examples came through Korah, Dathan, Abiram, and those who joined them. Their rebellion was not simply a private disagreement with Moses. They challenged the structure of leadership itself. Why should Moses and Aaron hold such authority? Was not the whole congregation holy? Had Moses brought Israel out of Egypt only to rule over them in the wilderness? The accusations touched one of the most dangerous themes in Israel's early history: distrust of the very leadership through which God had brought them this far. The crisis ended in judgment. Korah and those aligned with the rebellion were consumed in a catastrophic event described in Numbers, while others died when divine judgment spread through the camp. Yet even after this complaining continued, the wilderness generation did not fail because it lacked evidence. It failed despite evidence. That distinction would matter throughout the rest of Israel's history. The nation would repeatedly see deliverance, warning, provision, and judgment, yet still struggle to remain faithful. Years passed. One generation faded. Another grew up beneath desert skies. Then came another crisis over water. The people gathered against Moses and Aaron. There was no water for the congregation. The complaint was bitter. Why had they been brought into the wilderness? Why had they been led to such a place? Moses and Aaron went before the Lord. Moses was instructed to take the staff, gather the congregation, and speak to the rock. But when Moses stood before the people, frustration overtook him.
"Listen, you rebels," he said in anger. Then, instead of speaking to the rock as instructed, he struck it twice. Water came out abundantly. The people drank. But Moses had crossed a line. The miracle still occurred. The people still received water. Yet Moses and Aaron were told that because they had not honored God as holy before Israel, they would not bring the congregation into the promised land. For Moses, this consequence carried enormous weight. He had left Midian to confront Pharaoh.
He had led Israel through the sea. He had stood at Sinai. He had interceded when the nation faced destruction. He had carried the complaints of a generation through the wilderness, but he would see the land from a distance rather than lead Israel into it. Even the greatest leader of Israel's founding generation was not above accountability. The wilderness years moved toward their conclusion. Aaron died. Miriam died. Israel approached the territory east of the Jordan. New conflicts emerged. When the people became impatient and spoke against God and Moses, venomous serpents spread among them. Many were bitten. The people confessed their sin and asked Moses to intercede. He was instructed to make a bronze serpent and raise it on a pole. Those who looked toward it after being bitten lived. It was another moment in which judgment and mercy stood side by side. The same people who repeatedly rebelled were repeatedly preserved. Then Israel faced opposition from kingdoms east of the Jordan. Sihon, king of the Amorites, refused Israel passage and came out to fight. Israel defeated him. Og, king of Bashan, also confronted Israel and was defeated. These victories changed the atmosphere around the nation. For decades, Israel had appeared to be a wandering people. Now, neighboring rulers began to fear them. One of those rulers was Balak, king of Moab. Balak had heard what Israel had done to the Amorites and feared that the same fate might come to Moab. But rather than confronting Israel immediately through battle, he sought another kind of weapon. He summoned Balaam, a diviner known for pronouncing blessings and curses. Balak wanted Israel cursed. Balaam's story is one of the more unusual episodes in Israel's wilderness journey. Despite pressure and promised reward, Balaam repeatedly found himself unable to pronounce the curse Balak desired. Instead, blessings came from his mouth. Balak moved him from place to place, hoping that a different view or another ritual setting might change the outcome. It did not. The people Balak wanted cursed remained blessed. Yet immediately after this episode, Israel nearly destroyed itself through compromise. At Peor, Israelite men became involved with Moabite and Midianite women and participated in the worship of Baal. Once again, the central danger was not only the army outside the camp, it was unfaithfulness within it. A plague struck Israel. Judgment came. The episode reinforced a lesson that would echo for centuries. Israel could defeat military enemies and still be conquered spiritually through compromise. By now, the old Exodus generation was almost gone. A new census counted the generation preparing to enter the land. Moses stood near the end of his life. The leadership would soon pass to Joshua. Before that transition, Moses addressed Israel in the plains of Moab. The book of Deuteronomy presents much of this final instruction. This was not merely a repetition of laws. It was covenant renewal for a new generation. Most of those listening had been children or had not yet been born when Israel stood at Sinai. Now they stood on the threshold of Canaan. Moses reminded them where they had come from. He reminded them of their parents' rebellion. He repeated the call to obedience. He warned them against idolatry. He told them that prosperity in the land could become its own kind of danger. Israel must not enter Canaan become secure, build houses, cultivate fields, enjoy abundance, and then forget the God who brought them out of slavery. The warning was prophetic in more than one sense. Israel's future greatest threat would often arrive not when the nation was weak, but when it was comfortable. Moses summarized Israel's covenant responsibility with words that became central to Jewish faith. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Israel was to love the Lord with all its heart, soul, and strength. This love was not meant to remain abstract. The commands were to shape households. Parents were to teach their children. The covenant was to influence memory worship, justice, economics, community life, and national identity. Moses also set before Israel a choice: blessing and curse, life and death, obedience and rebellion. The covenant did not mean that Israel's future would unfold automatically regardless of its response. The land was a gift, but life in the land carried covenant responsibility. Then Moses climbed Mount Nebo. From there he was shown the land. He could see the territory toward which he had led Israel for decades. But he did not cross the Jordan. Moses died. The man whose life had connected Egypt, Sinai, wilderness, and covenant disappeared from the story before the conquest began. Israel mourned him. Then Joshua took command. The transition could not have been more significant. Moses belonged to the generation of Exodus. Joshua would belong to the generation of inheritance. His task was not to confront Pharaoh. His task was to lead Israel across the Jordan and into Canaan. The command repeated to Joshua was clear: be strong and courageous. Israel was entering a new stage of its history. The wilderness had required endurance. Canaan would require action. Before crossing the river, Joshua sent 2 spies toward Jericho. The city stood as one of the first major obstacles west of the Jordan. The spies entered the house of Rahab, a woman living in Jericho. News of Israel had already reached the city. Rahab explained that the inhabitants had heard what had happened at the Red Sea and what Israel had done to the Amorite kings. Fear had spread. Rahab chose to protect the spies. In return, she asked that she and her family be spared when Israel attacked. A scarlet cord would mark her house. The spies returned to Joshua with a report very different from the fearful report of the earlier generation. The land was vulnerable. Its inhabitants were afraid. Then Israel approached the Jordan. The river stood between the people and the land their ancestors had been promised. The priests carrying the ark moved forward. When their feet entered the water, the flow stopped. Israel crossed on dry ground. The imagery deliberately echoed the Exodus. One generation had crossed the sea to leave slavery. Now another generation crossed the Jordan to enter inheritance. Stones were taken from the river as a memorial. Future children would ask what they meant, and the answer would preserve memory. Israel's faith was meant to be historical. Its children were to know what had happened. The nation was to remember that it did not create itself. Then came Jericho. The city was shut tightly because of Israel. From a conventional military perspective, the strategy that followed seemed strange. Israel did not immediately storm the walls. For 6 days the army marched around the city once each day, accompanied by priests and the ark. On the 7th day they circled the city 7 times. The priests blew trumpets, the people shouted, the walls collapsed. Israel entered the city. Rahab and her household were spared according to the promise made by the spies. Jericho became a dramatic first victory, but success immediately gave way to failure. Israel attacked the smaller city of Ai. The scouts expected little difficulty. Only a limited force seemed necessary. But Israel was defeated. Men died. Joshua fell before the Lord in grief. How could the nation that had just seen Jericho fall lose to a smaller city? The answer lay inside the camp. A man named Achan had taken items from Jericho that had been placed under the ban. Israel's defeat was connected to covenant violation. The sin was exposed, judgment followed. Then Israel returned to Ai, this time with a larger strategy, and the city was defeated. Again, the conquest narrative emphasized that victory did not depend merely upon superior numbers or military confidence. Israel could not separate success from covenant faithfulness. Soon, another complication arose. The people of Gibeon heard what had happened to Jericho and Ai. Instead of fighting directly, they used deception. They dressed as travelers from a distant land. Their provisions were worn. Their bread appeared old. They claimed to have come from far away and sought a treaty with Israel. Joshua and the leaders examined what they had brought, but the text pointedly notes that they did not seek counsel from the Lord. Israel made a covenant with them. 3 days later, the deception was discovered. The Gibeonites were not distant travelers. They lived nearby. Israel was now bound by an oath that had been secured through fraud. The decision could not simply be erased. The Gibeonites were spared. though they were assigned servant roles connected with Israel's community and worship. The episode showed that Israel's leaders could make serious errors not only through open rebellion, but through confidence in their own judgment. The conquest continued. A coalition of southern kings attacked Gibeon because of its treaty with Israel. Joshua marched to defend the city. The battle became one of the most famous in the book bearing his name. Israel pursued its enemies. The narrative describes extraordinary divine intervention, including large hailstones and the remarkable account of the sun standing still while Israel continued the battle. However one approaches the precise mechanics of the passage, its theological purpose within Joshua is unmistakable. The victory is attributed not simply to Israel's strength, but to the Lord fighting for Israel. Southern cities fell. Then northern rulers gathered an enormous force under Jabin, king of Hazor. Their armies appeared formidable, their chariots were numerous. But Joshua attacked. Hazor, a major northern center, was captured and burned. By the later chapters of Joshua, the book could summarize the broad conquest as a sweeping victory. Yet the same biblical record also makes clear that the conquest was not absolute. There were still territories not fully possessed. There were Canaanite populations that remained. Some were placed under forced labor rather than driven out. Some regions remained beyond Israel's effective control. The apparent contradiction disappears when the conquest is understood as a major military collapse of organized resistance, followed by a longer process of occupation, settlement, and consolidation. Israel had broken major coalitions. It had not removed every source of future compromise. The land was then distributed among the tribes. The descendants of Reuben, Gad, and half the tribe of Manasseh had already received territory east of the Jordan under arrangements made before Moses' death. West of the Jordan, tribal inheritances were assigned. Judah received territory in the south. Ephraim and the other half of Manasseh occupied major regions in the center. Benjamin received land between powerful neighbors. Other tribes received their own portions. Levi was different. The Levites did not receive one large tribal territory like the others. Their cities were distributed throughout Israel, and their religious role distinguished them within the covenant community. Cities of refuge were also established, creating places where those responsible for accidental death could seek protection while legal circumstances were examined. Israel was not simply occupying geography. A social order was being planted into the land. Joshua eventually gathered the tribes at Shechem. The location itself carried ancient memory. Abraham had passed through that region. Jacob had connections there. Now the tribes of Israel stood together as a people established in Canaan. Joshua recounted their story. He began beyond the Euphrates with ancestors who had once served other gods. He moved through Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Egypt, Moses, the Exodus, the wilderness, and the conquest. Then came the choice. Israel must decide whom it would serve. Joshua's declaration has echoed through generations. "As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." The people answered that they too would serve the Lord. They had seen what he had done. They knew their history. They renewed covenant commitment. Joshua warned them that this was not a casual promise. The Lord was holy. The covenant could not be treated lightly. Still, the people insisted. They would serve the Lord. A covenant ceremony followed. A stone was set up as a witness. The nation had crossed into the land. The tribes had received inheritance. Major enemies had been defeated. The generation under Joshua had seen the promise move from distant expectation toward visible fulfillment. If Israel's history had ended here, the story might have appeared almost complete. Abraham had been promised descendants. Israel had become numerous. Abraham had been promised land. The tribes now occupied Canaan. The family had become a nation. But underneath the victories lay unresolved problems. Many Canaanite communities remained. Foreign worship had not disappeared. The tribes possessed land, but they were not always united. There was no central human government capable of coordinating the entire nation. And the covenant that Israel had repeatedly promised to obey depended upon a faithfulness its history had not yet demonstrated for long. Joshua died. So did the elders who had shared his generation and personally remembered the works associated with the conquest. Then a new generation arose. Judges describes them with devastating simplicity. They did not know the Lord in the same way, nor the works he had done for Israel. This does not necessarily mean that every individual had never heard the stories. It means the memory of the covenant no longer governed the nation with the same force. The tribes began living among the remaining peoples of Canaan. Intermarriage increased. Foreign gods became attractive. Baal and Ashtoreth worship entered Israelite life. The very compromise Moses and Joshua had warned against began to spread. Israel had won the land. Now the land was beginning to change Israel. What followed was not a single rebellion or a single military defeat. It was a cycle. Israel abandoned covenant faithfulness. Foreign enemies oppressed them. The people cried out. A deliverer arose. Peace returned. Then, after the deliverer died, the cycle began again, often worse than before. This would become the defining rhythm of the next era. Othniel would rise. Ehud would strike against Moabite domination. Deborah and Barak would confront Canaanite power. Gideon would lead a small force against Midian. Jephthah would emerge from rejection to lead Israel east of the Jordan. Samson would battle the Philistines through a life marked by extraordinary strength and profound personal weakness. But the judges would not solve Israel's deeper problem. They could defeat armies. They could not permanently change the nation's heart. By the end of that age, the question would no longer be whether Israel had received the promised land. The question would be whether Israel could remain a covenant people inside it. And increasingly the answer would look uncertain. The conquest had given Israel territory. It had not given Israel lasting unity. The victories of Joshua had broken Canaanite resistance. They had not eliminated idolatry. The tribal system had created inheritance. It had not created stable national leadership. And as one generation forgot what the previous generation had witnessed, Israel began moving toward one of the darkest periods in its early history. A nation had been born. But without faithful leadership, that nation was beginning to fracture from within. The age of the judges collapsed without a king. Israel had entered the land. The tribes had received their inheritance. Joshua's generation had witnessed the collapse of major Canaanite resistance. But possession of the land did not produce lasting faithfulness. The next era would become one of the most unstable periods in Israel's history. There was no single national government strong enough to bind all the tribes together. There was no permanent royal dynasty. There was no centralized political structure capable of responding quickly to threats across the entire land. Instead, Israel existed as a confederation of tribes connected by ancestry, covenant, shared worship, and common memory. That structure could function when the tribes remained faithful and cooperated. But when covenant loyalty weakened, the system became dangerously fragile. The book of Judges describes a repeated pattern. Israel turned away from the Lord. Foreign powers gained strength over them. The people suffered. They cried out. A deliverer was raised up. The oppressor was defeated. The land experienced rest. Then the judge died, and Israel returned to rebellion, often falling deeper than before. This cycle was not merely political. The military crises were symptoms of a deeper spiritual collapse. Israel's enemies changed. The central problem did not. The nation repeatedly forgot the covenant that had given it identity. The first judges established the pattern. Othniel delivered Israel from oppression connected with a ruler from Mesopotamia. After him came Ehud. By that time, Moab had gained power over part of Israel. Eglon, king of Moab, had become the face of that domination. Ehud, a Benjaminite, described as left-handed, gained access to the king by bringing tribute. He returned with what he presented as a private message. When the two men were alone, Ehud struck. Eglon was killed. Ehud escaped, gathered Israel, and led the people against Moab. The result was a major reversal. The oppressed became the victors. The land experienced a long period of rest. But rest did not become renewal. When pressure disappeared, faithfulness faded again. Then came a major threat from Canaanite power in the north. Jabin, king of Canaan, and his commander Sisera possessed something Israel feared deeply: iron chariots. In the ancient battlefield, chariots could dominate open terrain. Israel's tribal militias could appear desperately vulnerable against such forces. At this moment, one of the most important figures in Judges emerged: Deborah. She was a prophetess and judge. Israelites came to her for judgment, and she summoned Barak with a command to gather troops from Naphtali and Zebulun. Barak hesitated. He told Deborah that he would go only if she went with him. Deborah agreed. But she also warned that the honor of the final victory would not belong entirely to Barak. Sisera would fall into the hands of a woman. Israel gathered at Mount Tabor. Sisera mobilized his chariots. Then the battle turned. The Kishon region became the scene of Sisera's collapse. His chariot advantage failed him. His army was routed. Sisera abandoned his chariot and fled on foot. He sought refuge in the tent of Jael. She welcomed him. He asked for water. She gave him milk. Exhausted, he slept. Then Jael killed him. The commander who had terrified Israel did not die in glorious battle. He died while hiding. The victory was complete. Deborah's song celebrated the tribes that responded to the crisis and criticized those who remained distant. That detail reveals something important about Israel at this stage. Even when the nation faced common enemies, not every tribe always participated. The tribal confederation could unite, but unity was inconsistent. The fractures were already visible. After Deborah's era, the nation again drifted. Then Midian became the dominant threat. Unlike some earlier enemies who controlled cities or territory, the Midianite oppression devastated Israel through repeated raids. When Israel planted crops, Midianite forces and their allies invaded. They destroyed produce. They took livestock. They left little for Israel to survive on. The effect was psychological as well as economic. Israelites hid in caves and strongholds. A people once promised abundance in the land were now hiding from raiders in the land they had inherited. Then the Lord called Gideon. The first image of Gideon is not that of a fearless military hero. He was threshing wheat in a winepress, trying to hide the grain from Midian. The setting captured the condition of the nation. Everything was being done in fear. Gideon was addressed as a mighty warrior, but he immediately questioned the situation. If the Lord was with Israel, why had all this happened? Where were the wonders remembered from Egypt? Why had the nation been handed over to Midian? The question was understandable, but Judges had already given the answer. Israel had abandoned covenant loyalty. The problem was not that the God of the Exodus had lost power. The problem was that Israel wanted the protection of the covenant while repeatedly rejecting the covenant itself. Gideon was commissioned to deliver Israel. He doubted. He asked for signs. He feared his family was insignificant. He considered himself the least within it. Yet before Gideon confronted Midian, he had to confront idolatry closer to home. His father possessed an altar to Baal and an Asherah pole. Gideon tore them down at night. He built an altar to the Lord. The next morning, the town wanted him killed. The enemy was not merely outside Israel's borders. Baal had an altar within an Israelite household. That scene summarized the spiritual crisis of the period. Gideon gathered warriors. Thousands answered. Then his army was reduced. First, those who were afraid were allowed to leave. Most did. Then another selection reduced the force even further. Gideon was left with 300 men. The intention of the story is explicit. Israel must not conclude that its own military strength had saved it. The Midianite camp vastly outnumbered Gideon's small force. At night, the 300 men surrounded it, carrying trumpets, jars, and torches. At the signal, they broke the jars. The torches appeared. The trumpets sounded. The camp fell into confusion. Midianite forces turned against one another and fled. Israel pursued. The victory was dramatic. But Gideon's story did not end as cleanly as it began. After the victory, the Israelites asked Gideon to rule over them and establish a hereditary line. He refused the title in principle. He declared that the Lord should rule over Israel. Those words sounded faithful. His later actions were more complicated. Gideon requested gold from the spoils of war. With it, he made an ephod. Whatever his initial intention, the object became a spiritual snare. Israel treated it improperly. Gideon also lived with many wives and fathered numerous sons. One son born through a concubine in Shechem was named Abimelech. The name itself carried royal associations. Gideon had rejected kingship verbally. His household nevertheless began to resemble a royal household. After his death, the contradictions erupted. Abimelech wanted power. To eliminate rivals, he arranged the killing of his brothers. Nearly all of them were murdered on one stone. Only Jotham escaped. Abimelech then became ruler over Shechem. Israel had not yet formally established a monarchy, yet already one man had pursued kingship through bloodshed. Jotham responded with a parable. In it, trees sought a king. The productive trees refused to abandon their useful roles. Finally, the bramble accepted. The image was sharp. A worthless plant offered itself as king and threatened destruction if the trees did not trust its shade. Abimelech's rule eventually ended violently. His allies turned against him. Conflict spread. During the siege of a city, a woman dropped an upper millstone from a tower. It crushed Abimelech's skull. He ordered his armor-bearer to kill him so people would not say that a woman had killed him. The irony was complete. A man who had slaughtered his brothers to create a dynasty died without establishing one. The age of the judges continued. Smaller figures appeared: Tola, Jair, Ibsan, Elon, Abdon. Some receive only brief mention. Others emerge in much larger narratives. Then Israel fell under the pressure of the Ammonites. The tribes east of the Jordan suffered intensely. When the people cried out, the divine response was initially severe. Israel had repeatedly abandoned the Lord for the gods of surrounding nations. Why not ask those gods for rescue? The people confessed their sin and removed foreign gods. Then attention turned toward a potential deliverer, Jephthah. His early life was marked by rejection. He was the son of Gilead, but his mother was not Gilead's wife. His half-brothers drove him away so that he would not share in the inheritance. Jephthah settled in the land of Tob, where a group of men gathered around him. Then the Ammonite threat became serious enough that the elders who had once belonged to the society that rejected him came looking for him. They needed a warrior. Jephthah negotiated his return. If he defeated Ammon, he would become their leader. Before battle, Jephthah attempted diplomacy. He sent messages challenging the Ammonite claim to Israelite territory. His argument appealed to the history of Israel's journey into the land. But diplomacy failed. Then Jephthah made a vow. He promised that if he returned victorious, whatever came out of the doors of his house to meet him would belong to the Lord, and he would offer it as a burnt offering. The wording has produced centuries of debate about exactly how the vow and its fulfillment should be understood. But the narrative itself presents the event as tragic. Jephthah won the battle. He returned home. The first person to come out to meet him was his daughter, his only child. She came with tambourines and dancing, celebrating his victory. The scene turned celebration into grief. Judges does not present Jephthah's vow as a model to imitate. The episode belongs to a book increasingly showing what happens when Israel's spiritual and moral judgment deteriorates. Even its deliverers are becoming deeply flawed. Then Jephthah's victory led to conflict with another Israelite tribe. The Ephraimites accused him of failing to call them to battle. The dispute escalated into civil violence. Men of Gilead fought Ephraim. At the crossings of the Jordan, pronunciation was used to identify fugitives. Those unable to pronounce Shibboleth correctly were exposed. Israelites killed Israelites. The pattern was worsening. Foreign oppression was no longer the only danger. The tribes themselves were beginning to turn on one another. Then the narrative shifts toward the Philistines. They would become one of Israel's greatest enemies before and during the rise of the monarchy. The Philistines possessed organized settlements along the coastal plain and would increasingly pressure Israel from the west. During this period, a child was announced before his birth. His parents belonged to the tribe of Dan. His father was Manoah. His mother had been unable to bear children. A divine messenger announced that she would have a son. The child was to be set apart as a Nazirite from the womb. His hair was not to be cut. He would begin to deliver Israel from the Philistines. His name was Samson. Few biblical characters illustrate the contradiction of the period more vividly. Samson possessed extraordinary strength, but strength of body was repeatedly accompanied by weakness of judgment. He was drawn toward Philistine women despite conflict with his parents. His marriage celebration became a confrontation built around a riddle. The dispute escalated. Samson killed men to settle the wager. His intended wife was given to another man. Samson retaliated by destroying Philistine crops. The Philistines retaliated by killing the woman and her father. Samson responded with further violence. The cycle of personal revenge and national conflict intensified. At one point, Samson killed 1,000 Philistines using the jawbone of a donkey. At another, he carried away the gates of Gaza. He could overpower men, but he repeatedly failed to control his own desires. Eventually, Samson became involved with Delilah. Philistine rulers offered her a great reward to discover the source of his strength. Again and again she asked him. Again and again he gave misleading answers. Yet Samson continued returning to the relationship. Finally, he revealed the truth concerning his Nazirite hair. His hair was cut while he slept. The Philistines seized him. His eyes were put out. The man who had repeatedly been governed by what he saw was now blind. He was taken to Gaza in chains and forced to grind grain in prison. Samson's strength had once terrified the Philistines. Now he became entertainment. But his hair began to grow again. During a great celebration to the Philistine god Dagon, Samson was brought out before a massive crowd. He asked to be positioned between the supporting pillars of the building. Then he prayed. For one final moment, his strength returned. Samson pushed against the pillars. The structure collapsed. He died with the Philistines. The biblical narrator says that in his death, he killed more than during his life. It was a victory, but it was also a tragedy. Israel's judge delivered through his own destruction, and even this did not end Philistine power. The later chapters of Judges become darker still. The book moves away from stories of external enemies and shows Israel disintegrating internally. One episode begins with a man from the hill country of Ephraim and a Levite connected with his household. The man had created carved and metal images and established a private shrine. A Levite became his personal priest. The tribe of Dan, searching for territory, eventually encountered this household. Danite warriors stole the religious objects and persuaded the Levite to join them. They then attacked Laish, a peaceful and isolated city, destroyed it, rebuilt it under the name Dan, and established the stolen image there. The point of the story is not merely that one household practiced unauthorized worship. Religious disorder had spread from a private home into the identity of an entire tribal settlement. The final narrative is even more disturbing. A Levite and his concubine traveled through the territory of Benjamin and stopped in Gibeah. An old man offered them hospitality. During the night, violent men surrounded the house. The events that followed were horrific. The woman was abused and died. The Levite then divided her body and sent the pieces throughout Israel. The shocking act summoned the tribes into action. For once, Israel united rapidly. But it united for civil war. The tribes demanded that Benjamin hand over the guilty men of Gibeah. Benjamin refused. Battle began. At first, the larger Israelite force suffered terrible losses. Eventually, Benjamin was nearly destroyed. Tens of thousands died, cities burned. When the fighting ended, Israel suddenly realized what it had done. One tribe stood on the edge of disappearance. The nation that had been commanded to drive out corrupt influences from Canaan had nearly driven out one of its own tribes. Then another moral crisis followed. The Israelites had sworn not to give their daughters as wives to Benjamin. But if Benjamin had no future families, the tribe could vanish. Israel attempted to solve the problem through further violence and manipulation. The solutions were as troubling as the crisis they were meant to repair. Judges ends without resolving the disorder. Instead, it repeats a sentence that summarizes the entire era. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. The statement does not mean that simply having any king would automatically solve Israel's problems. Later history would prove that kings themselves could become sources of rebellion. But the line identifies the political and moral fragmentation of the period. Israel had no stable central leadership. Tribal loyalty could outweigh national unity. Local worship could drift from covenant standards. Individuals defined righteousness for themselves. Foreign oppression alternated with internal collapse, and the judges, though often used to bring real deliverance, could not create lasting transformation. The nation needed something more permanent. The Book of Ruth offers a quieter story from this same general era. While Judges shows national chaos, Ruth focuses on faithfulness within an ordinary family. A famine drove Elimelech, Naomi, and their sons from Bethlehem into Moab. There, Naomi lost her husband and both sons. One daughter-in-law, Ruth, chose to remain with her. Ruth was a Moabite, a foreign woman. Yet she committed herself to Naomi and to Naomi's God. The two women returned to Bethlehem. Ruth gathered grain in the fields of Boaz, a man connected with Naomi's family. Through the customs of kinship redemption, Boaz eventually married Ruth. Their son was Obed. Obed became the father of Jesse. Jesse became the father of David. That genealogy transforms the scale of Ruth's story. In the middle of the age when Israel was politically fractured and morally unstable, the family line of Israel's future king was quietly taking shape. The contrast is powerful. Nationally, Israel appeared to be falling apart, but within Bethlehem, a line was forming that would eventually lead to the monarchy. Before David, however, another figure had to emerge: Samuel. His story began in a family marked by sorrow. Elkanah had two wives, Hannah and Peninnah. Peninnah had children. Hannah did not. Her inability to bear children caused deep grief, intensified by Peninnah's provocation. During a visit to the sanctuary at Shiloh, Hannah prayed with such intensity that Eli the priest initially misunderstood her behavior. She vowed that if God gave her a son, she would dedicate him to the Lord. Her prayer was answered. She named the child Samuel. When Samuel was old enough, Hannah brought him to serve at the sanctuary under Eli. Samuel grew there, but the priestly household around him was corrupt. Eli's sons Hophni and Phinehas abused their position. They treated offerings with contempt. Their behavior damaged the worship entrusted to them. Eli rebuked them, but he failed to restrain them effectively. Then one night Samuel heard his name being called. He assumed Eli had summoned him. 3 times he went to the old priest. Eventually Eli understood. The Lord was calling Samuel. Samuel responded, and the message he received was severe. Judgment was coming upon Eli's house. A new prophetic voice was rising in Israel at precisely the moment when existing leadership was failing. Samuel grew, his credibility spread. Israel recognized him as a prophet. Then conflict with the Philistines intensified. Israel went into battle and was defeated. Thousands died. The elders responded with a dangerous assumption. They decided to bring the Ark of the Covenant from Shiloh into the camp. Perhaps its presence would guarantee victory. When the Ark arrived, Israel shouted so loudly that the earth seemed to shake. The Philistines were afraid. They had heard about Israel's God and what had happened in Egypt, but fear did not prevent them from fighting. The battle was devastating. Israel was defeated again. Hophni and Phinehas died, and the ark was captured. When Eli heard the news, especially that the ark had been taken, he fell backward from his seat and died. The sanctuary leadership connected with his household collapsed in a single day. The capture of the ark seemed almost unthinkable. The object associated with God's covenant presence was now in Philistine hands. Had Israel's God been defeated? The following events answered that question. The Philistines placed the ark in the temple of Dagon. The next morning, Dagon's image had fallen face down before it. They set the image upright. The following morning, it had fallen again, this time damaged. Affliction spread among Philistine cities associated with the ark. Eventually, the Philistines decided to send it back. The ark returned to Israel not because Israel had rescued it, but because the Philistines wanted it gone. That distinction mattered. Israel had attempted to use the ark as a weapon. The ark had not protected an unfaithful army. Yet neither could the Philistines control the God whose covenant it represented. Samuel then called Israel to repentance. Foreign gods were to be removed. The people gathered at Mizpah. The Philistines attacked. Samuel cried out to the Lord. Israel won a major victory. A stone was raised and named Ebenezer, marking the confession that the Lord had helped them. For a time, Samuel's leadership brought stability. But Samuel grew old. His sons did not walk faithfully in his ways. They accepted bribes and perverted justice. Once again, Israel faced a leadership crisis. The elders gathered. Their request would change the nation permanently. They wanted a king. They wanted a king to judge them. They wanted a king to lead them. And significantly, they wanted to be like the nations around them. The desire did not arise from nowhere. Israel had lived through generations of fragmentation. The judges came and went. Tribal unity was unreliable. Philistine pressure remained serious. Samuel was aging. His sons were corrupt. From a political perspective, the request made sense. But the spiritual motive was more complicated. Israel was not simply asking for orderly government. It was asking for security in the form the surrounding nations recognized. A permanent throne, a centralized army, a visible ruler. Samuel was displeased, but the Lord told him to listen to the people. Their rejection went deeper than Samuel. They were rejecting divine kingship in favor of a human king like the nations. Still, Israel would receive what it requested. Samuel warned them, a king would take sons for war. He would take daughters for service. He would take fields, vineyards, servants, and portions of their produce. Royal government would demand something from them. The people insisted no. They wanted a king. The era of the judges was ending. Israel had entered Canaan as a tribal covenant nation without a human monarch. Now centuries of instability had driven the people toward a throne. But the next question would determine the course of everything that followed. What kind of king would Israel receive? Would a monarchy heal the fractures? Would centralized leadership preserve covenant faithfulness? Or would a king simply give Israel's deepest problems a crown? The answer would begin with a man from the tribe of Benjamin. His name was Saul, and with his anointing, Israel would enter the age of kings. The rise of the kingdom. Saul, David, and Solomon. Israel wanted a king. Not another temporary judge, not another tribal leader who would rise during a crisis and disappear when the crisis ended. The people wanted a permanent throne, a standing army, and a ruler who could lead them against their enemies. They wanted to be like the nations around them. And the first man chosen to carry that burden came from the tribe of Benjamin. His name was Saul. When Saul first entered the story, he was not searching for a crown. He was searching for lost donkeys. His father Kish had sent him out with a servant to recover the animals. After a long and unsuccessful search, Saul considered returning home. His servant suggested that they consult a man of God living nearby. That man was Samuel. Before Saul arrived, Samuel had already been told that a man from Benjamin was coming, and that he would be anointed as ruler over Israel. When Saul appeared, Samuel treated him with unexpected honor. Then, privately, Samuel poured oil over Saul's head. The age of the monarchy had begun. Saul himself seemed overwhelmed by the idea. His tribe was Benjamin, one of Israel's smallest. His family did not appear politically dominant. When the people later gathered and Saul was publicly selected, he was found hiding among the baggage. The man Israel wanted as a visible king initially seemed reluctant even to be seen. But physically, Saul looked like a king. The biblical text emphasizes his impressive appearance. He stood taller than the people around him. When Samuel presented him, the crowd shouted, "Long live the king!" Yet appearance would not determine whether Saul's reign succeeded. The deeper question was covenant faithfulness. Samuel made clear that monarchy did not replace Israel's obligation to God. The king was not above the covenant. The people were not free to trust a throne instead of the Lord. If king and people remained faithful, the monarchy could serve Israel. If they rebelled, kingship would not protect them from judgment. Saul's first major test came quickly. Nahash the Ammonite threatened Jabesh-Gilead. The situation was humiliating and dangerous. When Saul heard what had happened, the Spirit of God came powerfully upon him. He summoned Israel. A national army gathered. The Ammonites were defeated. The victory transformed Saul's public standing. Those who had questioned whether he could save Israel were silenced. At Gilgal, the kingship was renewed with celebration. For a moment, the monarchy appeared to be exactly what Israel had hoped for. A strong leader, a united army, a defeated enemy, national confidence. But the first cracks appeared soon afterward. The Philistines remained Israel's most serious military threat. Their forces gathered in overwhelming numbers. Israelite soldiers became frightened. Men hid in caves, pits, rocks, and tombs. Others fled across the Jordan. Saul waited at Gilgal for Samuel to arrive and offer sacrifice. Samuel did not appear within the expected time. The army began slipping away. Saul panicked. He offered the burnt offering himself. Then Samuel arrived. Saul tried to justify his action. The people were scattering, the Philistines were gathering, Samuel had not arrived when expected. The military situation seemed desperate. But Samuel's judgment focused on something deeper. Saul had failed to keep the command he had been given. His kingdom would not endure. Another man would eventually be chosen. This did not mean Saul lost the throne immediately. He continued to reign. He continued to fight. He achieved real military successes. His son Jonathan emerged as a courageous warrior whose faith often contrasted with Saul's growing fear. In one remarkable episode, Jonathan and his armor-bearer approached a Philistine outpost almost alone. Jonathan reasoned that the Lord was not limited by numbers. Their attack triggered panic in the Philistine camp. Israel rallied. The enemy fled. But even during victory, Saul's leadership created unnecessary danger. He placed the army under an oath not to eat until he had taken revenge on his enemies. Jonathan had not heard the command. He ate honey and regained strength. When the violation became known, Saul was prepared to have his own son executed. The people intervened. They refused to allow the man through whom such a great victory had come to die. The episode exposed a growing problem. Saul could lead armies, but fear, impulsiveness, and an obsession with control were beginning to distort his judgment. Then came the confrontation that permanently altered the direction of his reign. Saul was commanded to carry out judgment against Amalek. The instructions were severe. Saul went to war. He won, but he did not completely carry out what had been commanded. Agag, king of Amalek, was spared. The best animals were preserved. When Samuel confronted Saul, the king initially claimed obedience. Then came the sound that contradicted him, the bleating of sheep, the lowing of cattle. Saul explained that the best animals had been kept for sacrifice. Samuel responded with one of the central principles of Israel's monarchy. Obedience was better than sacrifice. Religious activity could not cover deliberate disobedience. Saul finally admitted that he had feared the people and listened to them. That confession revealed the weakness at the center of his kingship. Israel had asked for a king who would lead them. Saul increasingly allowed the pressure of the people, the fear of enemies, and the need to preserve his own position to lead him instead. Samuel announced that the kingdom would be torn from him and given to another. Again, Saul remained on the throne, but the future of the monarchy had shifted. Samuel mourned for him. Then the Lord sent Samuel to Bethlehem. There lived a man named Jesse. One of Jesse's sons would be anointed. Samuel arrived and saw Eliab, Jesse's eldest. Eliab looked impressive. Samuel thought this must be the chosen man. But he was warned not to judge by appearance or height. Humans looked at outward appearance. The Lord looked at the heart. One by one, Jesse's sons passed before Samuel. None was chosen. Finally, Samuel asked whether there were any others. The youngest was away tending sheep. His name was David. He was called in from the fields, and there, surrounded by his brothers, David was anointed. The Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon him, yet no army immediately gathered around David. No royal announcement replaced Saul. No throne changed hands. David returned to the world he already knew. The future king remained a shepherd. Meanwhile, Saul's condition deteriorated. David entered the royal household partly because of his ability with the lyre. His music brought Saul relief during periods of distress. The relationship between the rejected king and the anointed successor had begun before either man's political future was fully visible. Then the Philistines gathered for war. Their champion stepped forward, Goliath of Gath. The exact details of his height are transmitted differently in ancient textual traditions, but every version presents the same essential picture. He was a formidable warrior whose size, armor, and confidence terrified Israel. Day after day, he challenged the Israelite army. Choose a man to fight him. If Israel's representative won, the Philistines would serve Israel. If Goliath won, Israel would serve the Philistines. Saul, the king, who stood taller than other Israelites, did not go out. Neither did Israel's experienced soldiers. Then David arrived at the camp. He had come to bring provisions to his brothers. He heard Goliath's challenge. David's reaction was different from the army's. The soldiers saw the size of the warrior. David saw the insult against the God of Israel. Saul eventually allowed him to fight. David rejected Saul's armor. He took his staff, sling, and stones. Goliath mocked him. David answered that the battle belonged to the Lord. The confrontation ended quickly. David's sling stone struck Goliath. The giant fell. David used Goliath's own sword to finish the battle. The Philistine army fled. Israel pursued. The shepherd from Bethlehem became a national hero in a single day. But victory brought David into dangerous proximity to Saul. Jonathan, Saul's son, formed a deep covenant friendship with David. David succeeded in military assignments. His reputation spread. Women celebrated Israel's victories with songs comparing Saul's thousands with David's tens of thousands. Saul heard the comparison. Jealousy entered. The king began watching David with suspicion. The man who had defeated Saul's enemy now appeared in Saul's mind to be his greatest threat. Twice, Saul attempted to pin David to the wall with a spear. David escaped. Saul placed him in military danger, hoping the Philistines might kill him. Instead, David succeeded. Saul promised his daughter Michal to David under conditions meant to expose him to further risk. David survived again. Michal loved him. Jonathan defended him. The people admired him. And the more Saul tried to destroy David, the more obvious David's success became. Eventually, David had to flee. The future king became a fugitive. Men in distress, debt, and discontent gathered around him. He lived in wilderness strongholds. He moved through caves and border regions. He fought enemies while avoiding the army of Israel's own king. At several moments, David had opportunities to kill Saul. One came in a cave. Saul entered unaware that David and his men were hiding deeper inside. David's men interpreted the moment as providence. Here was the enemy. Here was the chance. David secretly cut a piece from Saul's robe. Even that act troubled him. He refused to kill the Lord's anointed. Later, David revealed that he could have taken Saul's life. Saul was shaken. He acknowledged, at least temporarily, that David was more righteous than he was. But the pursuit eventually resumed. Another opportunity came when David entered Saul's camp at night. The king slept. His spear was beside him. One of David's men offered to kill Saul with a single strike. Again, David refused. The throne would not be obtained through murdering the man currently occupying it. David's restraint did not mean that his fugitive years were free from moral complexity. He could act harshly. His anger nearly led him to destroy the household of Nabal after Nabal insulted and rejected him. Only the intervention of Abigail prevented bloodshed. Her wisdom stopped David from committing an act he might later have regretted. Nabal later died. David eventually married Abigail. The episode showed that David, like every major figure before him, was not presented as morally flawless. He could trust God in one moment and nearly surrender to vengeance in another. As Saul's pursuit continued, David took refuge among the Philistines and lived under Achish of Gath. The situation was deeply ironic. Israel's future king was living among Israel's enemies because Israel's present king wanted him dead. Meanwhile, Saul's final crisis approached. The Philistines gathered again. Samuel had died. Saul sought guidance but received no answer through the usual means. Desperate, he went to a medium at Endor, despite having previously removed such practices from the land. The king, who had repeatedly failed to obey clear revelation, now sought forbidden guidance when silence frightened him. The encounter announced disaster. Saul and his sons would die. The next day, battle came on Mount Gilboa. Israel was defeated. Jonathan died. So did his brothers. Saul was badly wounded. Fearing capture and abuse by the Philistines, he fell on his own sword after his armor-bearer refused to kill him. Israel's first king died on a battlefield. The reign that had begun with hope ended in defeat. When David received the news, he did not celebrate. He mourned Saul. He mourned Jonathan. His lament preserved both grief and honor. Jonathan had been his closest friend. Saul had been his persecutor. Yet David refused to reduce Saul's entire life to the hatred of its final years. Then David went to Hebron. The tribe of Judah anointed him king. But Israel was not immediately united. Abner, commander of Saul's army, supported Saul's surviving son Ishbosheth over the northern tribes. For years, two centers of power existed. David ruled Judah, Ishbosheth ruled much of Israel. Conflict followed. The house of Saul weakened. David's position grew stronger. Abner eventually broke with Ishbosheth and negotiated to bring the northern tribes to David. But Joab, David's military commander, killed Abner partly in revenge for the death of his brother Asahel. David publicly distanced himself from the murder. Then Ishbosheth himself was assassinated by men who expected David to reward them. Instead, David ordered their execution. Again, the biblical account emphasizes that David would not establish legitimacy by celebrating the murder of rivals. Eventually, the elders of Israel came to Hebron. They acknowledged their shared kinship with David and remembered that even during Saul's reign, David had led Israel in battle. David was anointed king over all Israel. The tribes were united under one ruler. Then David made one of the most important strategic decisions of his reign. He captured Jerusalem. The city stood in territory associated with the Jebusites and was situated between the major tribal regions of north and south. It had not been a traditional capital of either Saul's house or David's rule in Judah. That made it politically useful. Jerusalem became the city of David. A new national center was born. But David understood that political unity alone was not enough. He wanted the Ark of the Covenant brought to Jerusalem. The first attempt ended in tragedy when Uzzah touched the Ark after the oxen stumbled and died. David became afraid. The Ark remained temporarily in the household of Obed-Edom. After reports of blessing there, David made another attempt, this time with greater reverence. The Ark entered Jerusalem with celebration. David danced before the Lord. Sacrifices were offered. The political capital was becoming a religious center as well. Then David expressed a desire to build a permanent house for God. He lived in a palace. The Ark remained in a tent. The prophet Nathan initially encouraged him, but that night a different message came. David would not be the one to build the temple. Instead, God made a promise concerning David's house. David wanted to build a house for God. God promised to build a house for David, not a building, but a dynasty. His offspring would follow him. His throne would be established. This covenant with David became one of the most important developments in Israel's theology of kingship. The monarchy was no longer simply a political system requested by the people. The house of David now carried a particular covenant promise. But David's reign still had battles to fight. He defeated Philistine forces. Moab was subdued. Conflict with Aramean kingdoms expanded Israel's influence. Edom came under control. Military victories strengthened the kingdom. Territory expanded. Tribute increased. For the first time, Israel approached the kind of regional power the tribes could hardly have imagined during the age of the judges. David also remembered his covenant with Jonathan. He searched for surviving members of Saul's family to whom he could show kindness. He found Mephibosheth, Jonathan's son, who was disabled in both feet. Rather than eliminate him as a possible dynastic rival, David restored Saul's property to him and gave him a permanent place at the royal table. It was one of the more compassionate moments of David's reign. Then, at the height of his power, David committed the sin that would permanently scar his household. At a time when kings normally went out to war, David remained in Jerusalem. From the roof of his palace, he saw Bathsheba. She was married to Uriah the Hittite, one of David's soldiers. David sent for her. She became pregnant. David then attempted to conceal what had happened. He recalled Uriah from battle, hoping Uriah would go home and later assume the child was his. But Uriah refused to enjoy the comforts of home while Israel's soldiers remained in the field. David tried again. It failed. Then David sent Uriah back to the army carrying instructions for Joab. Uriah was to be placed in the fiercest fighting and abandoned. The plan worked. Uriah died. David took Bathsheba as his wife. From the outside, the scandal might have appeared buried. Then Nathan came to the king. The prophet told a story about a wealthy man who owned many animals and a poor man who had one beloved lamb. When a traveler arrived, the rich man refused to take from his own abundance. Instead, he seized the poor man's lamb. David reacted with anger. The man deserved judgment. Nathan answered, "You are the man." David's power had allowed him to take what belonged to another man and then arrange that man's death. The king responsible for justice had become the violator of justice. David confessed. He was not removed from the throne as Saul had been, but forgiveness did not mean the disappearance of consequences. The child born from the affair died, and Nathan warned that violence would rise within David's own house. What followed was a series of family disasters. David's son Amnon violated his half-sister Tamar. David became angry, but the narrative records no decisive justice from him. Tamar's brother Absalom waited. Then he arranged Amnon's death. Absalom fled. Eventually he returned to Jerusalem. But reconciliation with David remained incomplete. Absalom began building support among the people. He positioned himself near the city gate. He listened to grievances. He suggested that if only he were judge, people would receive justice. Slowly, he stole the hearts of Israel. Then he declared himself king. David was forced to flee Jerusalem. The king who had once hidden from Saul now fled from his own son. He crossed the Kidron Valley. He went up the Mount of Olives weeping. Loyal followers accompanied him. The kingdom appeared to be collapsing from inside the royal family. Absalom entered Jerusalem. David's advisors worked through competing strategies. Eventually, battle came in the forest of Ephraim. David ordered his commanders to deal gently with Absalom. But Absalom became caught while riding beneath the branches of a great tree. Joab found him. Ignoring David's command, Joab killed him. The rebellion ended. But David did not receive the news as a victorious king. He received it as a father. "Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom!" His grief was so intense that Joab warned him the army would feel ashamed for saving his life. David returned to Jerusalem. The kingdom survived, but the scars remained. More conflict followed. A rebellion led by Sheba exposed continuing tension between Judah and the northern tribes. The fracture that would eventually divide the nation after Solomon was already present beneath David's rule. Near the end of David's life, another controversy emerged when he ordered a census of Israel's fighting men. The act was judged as sinful, and a plague followed. David saw the suffering of the people and pleaded that judgment fall upon him and his household rather than the flock. The plague stopped near the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite. David purchased the site and built an altar there. That location would later become profoundly important. It would be associated with the temple built by David's son. As David aged, the question of succession became urgent. His son, Adonijah, attempted to establish himself as king. He gathered supporters. He held a feast. He acted as though the succession had already been decided. But Nathan the prophet and Bathsheba approached David. They reminded him that Solomon was to succeed him. David ordered that Solomon be publicly anointed. Solomon rode on the king's mule. Zadok the priest anointed him. Trumpets sounded. The people shouted. The city erupted in celebration. Adonijah's attempted coronation collapsed. The throne passed to Solomon. David's life ended after a reign that had transformed Israel. He had taken a divided people and established a united kingdom. He had made Jerusalem its capital. He had brought the ark there. He had expanded Israel's territory, and he had received the promise of a continuing dynasty. But his life had also demonstrated that even Israel's greatest king could abuse power, damage his household, and bring consequences upon the nation. The kingdom needed more than a powerful ruler. It needed a wise ruler. Solomon began his reign surrounded by both opportunity and danger. Political rivals had to be dealt with. Old conflicts from David's reign had to be resolved. Adonijah eventually made a request involving Abishag, the young woman who had attended David in his final years. Solomon interpreted the request as a challenge to the throne. Adonijah was executed. Joab, who had supported Adonijah and carried a long history of bloodshed, fled to the altar. He was killed there. Abiathar the priest was removed from office. Shimei, who had once cursed David, was placed under restrictions and later executed after violating them. The transition was severe. The new kingdom was being consolidated. Then came a different kind of moment. At Gibeon, Solomon offered sacrifices. In a dream, God told him to ask for what he wanted. Solomon could have asked for long life. He could have asked for wealth. He could have asked for the death of his enemies. Instead, he asked for wisdom and understanding heart to judge the people and distinguish between good and evil. The request pleased God. Solomon received wisdom along with wealth and honor. One famous judgment quickly demonstrated his reputation. Two women came before him, both claiming the same living child. Each said the dead child belonged to the other. Solomon ordered that a sword be brought and proposed dividing the living child. One woman accepted. The other begged that the child be given away rather than killed. Solomon identified her as the true mother. News of the judgment spread. Israel saw that the king possessed extraordinary wisdom. The kingdom entered an era of stability and expansion. Solomon organized administration. Officials governed districts. Trade networks developed. The court grew. Israel's influence reached beyond its borders. The biblical description presents Judah and Israel as numerous and prosperous. People ate and drank and lived securely. Solomon's wisdom became famous internationally. He was associated with thousands of proverbs and songs. He spoke about plants and animals. Foreign rulers sent representatives to hear him. Then Solomon undertook the project David had desired. The temple. David had prepared resources. Solomon now built. He worked with Hiram, king of Tyre. Cedar came from Lebanon. Stone was prepared. Labor was organized. The project took years. When completed, the temple gave Israel a permanent sanctuary in Jerusalem. Its architecture communicated gradations of sacred space. The most holy place stood at the center. The Ark of the Covenant was brought inside. At the dedication, priests carried the ark into its place. Then the glory of the Lord filled the temple so powerfully that the priests could not continue their service normally. Solomon stood before the altar and prayed. His prayer recognized a profound tension. Could God truly dwell in a building even the highest heavens could not contain him? Yet Solomon asked that the temple become a place toward which Israel could pray, a place associated with divine name forgiveness, justice, repentance, and covenant. He anticipated future failure. If Israel sinned, if enemies defeated them, if drought came, if famine came, if they were carried into foreign lands, then if they turned back and prayed, Solomon asked God to hear. Those words would become haunting later. The king dedicating the temple was already speaking about the possibility of exile. At this moment, however, exile seemed distant. Israel stood near the height of its national power. Jerusalem had become a magnificent capital. The temple stood. The kingdom was wealthy. Trade routes connected Solomon to distant regions. The Queen of Sheba came to test Solomon with difficult questions. She saw his wisdom, his palace, his officials, his wealth, and the organization of his court. She was overwhelmed by what she witnessed. Solomon's fame seemed to fulfill the image of Israel as a nation whose blessing could become visible among other peoples. This was the summit. The United Kingdom had reached heights no judge had achieved. No Philistine ruler was dictating Israel's future. The tribes were united. The Davidic dynasty was established. The temple stood in Jerusalem. The nation possessed wealth, international prestige, and peace. But the highest point in Israel's monarchy also contained the seeds of its collapse. Solomon accumulated enormous wealth. Gold flowed into his court. He multiplied horses. Many came from Egypt. He expanded royal power. Large labor forces were required for his building projects. Taxes and administrative burdens increased. And Solomon multiplied wives. The biblical account connects many of those marriages with foreign political alliances. His wives came from nations whose gods Israel had been repeatedly warned not to follow. As Solomon grew old, they turned his heart toward other gods. The man who had built the temple of the Lord built high places for foreign worship. He participated in practices connected with Ashtoreth, Chemosh, Molech, and other deities. This was not a minor private failure. Solomon was king. Royal compromise could shape the entire nation. The wisest man in the kingdom knew the covenant. Wisdom alone did not guarantee obedience. The Lord became angry with Solomon. The kingdom would be torn apart. Yet, because of David, the full rupture would not occur during Solomon's lifetime. His son would inherit the crisis. One tribe, broadly representing Judah and the Davidic center, would remain connected with David's house. The rest would be torn away. Opponents began to emerge. Hadad the Edomite became a threat. Rezin established power in Damascus. Then a man from inside Solomon's own administration appeared, Jeroboam son of Nebat. Jeroboam was capable and industrious. Solomon placed him over labor connected with the house of Joseph. Then the prophet Ahijah met Jeroboam outside Jerusalem. Ahijah wore a new garment. He tore it into 12 pieces. He told Jeroboam to take 10. The symbolism was unmistakable. The kingdom would be torn from Solomon's house. 10 tribes would be given to Jeroboam. The dynasty of David would retain a portion because of the covenant connected with David and Jerusalem. When Solomon learned of the threat, he sought Jeroboam's life. Jeroboam fled to Egypt. The irony was striking. The Exodus had defined Israel as the people delivered from Egypt. Now Egypt became a refuge for the man who would later rule most of Israel. Solomon eventually died after a reign of 40 years. His son Rehoboam inherited the throne. From the outside, the transfer looked orderly. A son of David's house still sat in Jerusalem. the temple still stood. The kingdom still appeared united. But beneath the royal ceremony, resentment had accumulated. The people had carried heavy burdens. Forced labor had expanded. Taxes had supported Solomon's immense building program and royal administration. The northern tribes wanted relief. Jeroboam returned from Egypt.
At Shechem, the people approached Rehoboam with a request. "Your father made our yoke heavy. Lighten the burden. If you do, we will serve you." This was the moment on which the united kingdom balanced. Rehoboam asked for time. The older advisors who had served Solomon urged moderation. Speak kindly to the people, reduce the pressure, win their loyalty. Then Rehoboam consulted the younger men who had grown up with him. Their advice was the opposite. Do not appear weak, do not reduce the burden, increase it. The king returned to the people, and he chose the language of power. His father had made the yoke heavy. He would make it heavier. His father had disciplined with whips. He would discipline with scorpions. The response from the northern tribes was immediate. "What share do we have in David?" The cry spread. The tribes rejected the house of David. Rehoboam attempted to send Adoram, the official, over forced labor. The people stoned him to death. Rehoboam barely escaped to Jerusalem. In a matter of days, the political achievement built through Saul, David, and Solomon collapsed. The united kingdom was over. Jeroboam would rule in the north, Rehoboam would rule Judah in the south. One nation had become two kingdoms. And the division was not merely political. Jeroboam feared that if his people continued traveling to Jerusalem to worship at the temple, their loyalty might eventually return to the house of David. So he created an alternative religious system. Golden calves were established at Bethel and Dan. Priests were appointed outside the traditional Levitical structure. A new festival calendar was introduced. Political insecurity reshaped worship. The northern kingdom would continue to call itself Israel. The southern kingdom would be known as Judah. Both descended from Jacob, both carried Israelite history, but from this point forward, their paths would diverge. The kingdom had reached its greatest glory under Solomon. It had a temple, a dynasty, wealth, wisdom, international prestige. Then, within one generation, it fractured. The threat Israel had feared during the days of the judges had not disappeared when the nation gained a king. It had simply changed form. Israel now had kings, and kings could divide a nation just as surely as they could unite one. The age of the united monarchy was over. The age of the divided kingdom had begun. And from this point onward, prophets would stand beside thrones. Armies would rise on Israel's borders. Idolatry would become institutionalized, and the question would no longer be whether the kingdom could reach greatness. The question would be how long two increasingly unfaithful kingdoms could survive. A divided nation, Israel and Judah. The kingdom had split. What David had united and Solomon had expanded now stood divided into two rival states. In the north was Israel, ruled by Jeroboam. In the south was Judah, ruled by Rehoboam, son of Solomon, and heir to the house of David. The division had political causes: heavy taxation, forced labor, royal arrogance, tribal resentment. But the deeper crisis quickly became spiritual. Jeroboam feared that religion could undo his new kingdom. Jerusalem, the temple, the priesthood, and the festivals remained in Judah. If the northern tribes continued traveling south to worship, Jeroboam worried that their hearts might eventually return to the Davidic throne. So he created an alternative. At Bethel, in the south of his territory, and Dan in the far north, Jeroboam established golden calves. He told the people that they no longer needed to travel to Jerusalem. He appointed priests who did not come from the traditional priestly structure.
He established new worship centers. He altered the religious calendar. Political insecurity became institutionalized idolatry, and from this point forward, the northern kingdom would repeatedly be measured against one devastating phrase: the sins of Jeroboam son of Nebat, who caused Israel to sin. Jeroboam's decision was not a temporary compromise. It became the foundation of the northern kingdom's religious system. Kings would come and go, dynasties would rise and be murdered, but the worship system created at the kingdom's birth would remain. A man of God came from Judah to Bethel and condemned the altar. He announced that judgment would eventually fall upon the corrupt worship established there. Jeroboam stretched out his hand and ordered the prophets seized. His hand became unable to withdraw. The altar split. Ashes poured out. Jeroboam asked for prayer, and his hand was restored. Yet even after a sign so direct, he did not abandon the system he had created. The kingdom had been warned at its beginning. It would not listen. In Judah, Rehoboam faced the consequences of his own arrogance. He strengthened cities. Priests and Levites who rejected Jeroboam's religious innovations migrated south. For a time, Judah benefited from their presence. But Rehoboam's kingdom also turned away from faithfulness. Idolatrous practices spread. High places, sacred pillars, and other forms of worship appeared throughout the land. Then Egypt returned to Israel's story. Shishak, Pharaoh of Egypt, invaded Judah. Jerusalem was threatened. The treasures of the temple and royal palace were taken. The gold shields Solomon had made disappeared into Egypt. Rehoboam replaced them with bronze. The image was symbolic. Under Solomon, the kingdom had displayed gold. Under his son, bronze substituted for what had been lost. The outward appearance of monarchy survived. The substance had diminished. Rehoboam eventually died. His son Abijah reigned briefly. Then came Asa. Asa represents one of the early moments when Judah attempted serious reform. He removed many idols. He challenged corrupt practices. He even removed his grandmother Maacah from her influential position because she had made an offensive image associated with Asherah worship. For much of his reign, Asa sought the Lord. But like so many kings, his story did not end with perfect consistency. When threatened by Baasha, king of Israel, Asa relied on an alliance with Ben-Hadad of Aram rather than trusting entirely in God. A prophet confronted him. Asa responded angrily and imprisoned the prophet. The king who had begun with reform ended with a more defensive and hardened spirit. Meanwhile, the northern kingdom entered a period of extraordinary instability. Jeroboam's son Nadab became king. He was assassinated by Baasha. Baasha exterminated Jeroboam's royal house. The dynasty disappeared exactly as judgment had foretold. But Baasha repeated Jeroboam's sins. His own dynasty therefore received a similar warning. After Baasha came Elah. Elah was murdered by one of his commanders, Zimri. Zimri then killed Baasha's household. His reign lasted only 7 days. The army proclaimed Omri king. Zimri, trapped in the royal palace at Tirzah, burned the palace around himself and died. The northern kingdom was scarcely a few generations old, and already the throne had become a place where assassination could produce a new dynasty overnight. Omri eventually secured power. Politically, he was significant. He purchased a hill and built a new capital there. The city was called Samaria. Samaria would become the political center of the northern kingdom and eventually the symbol of its fate. Omri also strengthened Israel's regional position, but the biblical evaluation of his reign focuses on another fact. He continued and deepened the pattern of rebellion. Then his son came to the throne, Ahab. Few names in the history of Israel would become more closely associated with apostasy. Ahab married Jezebel, daughter of the king of Sidon. The marriage likely carried political advantages. It also brought powerful religious consequences. Jezebel promoted the worship of Baal. Ahab built a temple and altar for Baal in Samaria. He made an Asherah. What Jeroboam had begun as a politically motivated alternative form of worship now expanded into royal sponsorship of foreign deities. At this moment, one of Israel's greatest prophets appeared, Elijah. His entrance into the story is abrupt. He came before Ahab and announced that there would be no dew or rain except by his word. Then he disappeared. Drought came. The crisis struck at the heart of Baal worship. Baal was associated in Canaanite religion with storms, fertility, and agricultural abundance. Yet Israel's land dried beneath the word of the Lord's prophet. Elijah was sustained first near a brook and later in the household of a widow at Zarephath outside Israel. Her flour and oil did not run out during the famine. When her son died, Elijah prayed and the child lived again. Meanwhile, the drought grew severe. Then Elijah returned. Ahab called him the troubler of Israel. Elijah reversed the accusation. The trouble, he said, came from Ahab's abandonment of the Lord's commands and his pursuit of the Baals. The confrontation moved to Mount Carmel. Elijah stood before Israel. The prophets of Baal were assembled. The question was direct. How long would Israel hesitate between two opinions? If the Lord was God, follow him. If Baal was God, follow him. Two sacrifices were prepared. No fire would be lit. The God who answered by fire would reveal his power. The prophets of Baal called out for hours. They shouted, they danced, they cut themselves according to their practices. Nothing happened. Elijah mocked the silence. Perhaps Baal was distracted, perhaps asleep, perhaps away. Still no answer came. Then Elijah repaired the altar of the Lord. He used 12 stones, a reminder that despite political division, Israel had originated from 12 tribes. The sacrifice was placed upon the altar. Water was poured over it repeatedly until everything was soaked and the trench around it filled. Then Elijah prayed. Fire fell. The sacrifice burned. The wood burned. The stones and dust were consumed. The water disappeared. The people fell down. The Lord, He is God. The prophets of Baal were killed. Soon afterward, rain returned. For a moment, Carmel seemed like a national turning point. But Jezebel responded with a death threat. Elijah fled. The prophet who had stood before a king, a nation, and hundreds of hostile prophets now collapsed emotionally in the wilderness. He asked to die. The contrast was striking. Public victory did not eliminate personal exhaustion. Elijah was fed. He traveled to Horeb, the mountain associated with Moses and covenant. There in wind, earthquake, and fire, the Lord was not represented in the way Elijah expected. Then came a quiet voice. Elijah was reminded that the story had not ended. New rulers would rise. Elisha would succeed him. And thousands in Israel had not bowed to Baal. The kingdom was corrupt, but it was not spiritually empty. A remnant remained. Ahab's reign continued through military conflict and political maneuvering. At times, Israel experienced victory over Aram. At other times, Ahab's character revealed the moral danger of royal power. The story of Naboth's vineyard became one of the clearest examples. Naboth owned a vineyard near Ahab's palace in Jezreel. Ahab wanted it. Naboth refused to sell because the land represented ancestral inheritance. Ahab went home resentful. Jezebel took control. She arranged false accusations of blasphemy and treason against Naboth. He was executed. Then Ahab went to take possession of the vineyard. Elijah met him there. The king had gained the land, but the crime had exposed his dynasty to judgment. Royal power had become predatory. The king of Israel was supposed to live under covenant law. Instead, Ahab and Jezebel had used political authority to destroy an innocent man and seize his inheritance. Ahab eventually died in battle. He had attempted to disguise himself while fighting Aram. A random arrow struck him between the sections of his armor. He bled in his chariot. By evening, he was dead. His house did not disappear immediately, but judgment had been set in motion. Elijah's ministry eventually gave way to Elisha. Elisha's prophetic career was filled with signs involving ordinary people and national crises. He purified water. He multiplied oil for a widow. He announced the birth of a son to a Shunammite woman and later restored the child to life. He healed Naaman, commander of the Aramean army, from leprosy. He fed people during scarcity. He also confronted kings and participated indirectly in moments of political transition. The prophetic ministry in Israel was not confined to royal courts. It reached households, foreigners, soldiers, widows, servants, and cities. But the northern kingdom continued toward violence. Jehu, a military commander, was anointed as an instrument of judgment against Ahab's house. He moved quickly. King Joram of Israel was killed. Ahaziah of Judah, who was with him, was also mortally wounded. Jezebel confronted Jehu from a window in Jezreel. She was thrown down. Ahab's descendants were eliminated. Baal worship received a devastating blow when Jehu gathered its worshippers under false pretenses and had them killed. The temple of Baal was destroyed, yet Jehu did not remove Jeroboam's calves at Bethel and Dan. He destroyed one form of apostasy while preserving another. This became another recurring pattern. Reform could be partial. A king could reject one evil and tolerate the system that had become politically useful. The house of Jehu lasted several generations, but Israel's deeper problems remained. Across the border, Judah was experiencing crises of its own. The two kingdoms sometimes fought each other. Sometimes they allied. Royal marriages connected them. Those alliances could spread northern corruption southward. Athaliah, connected to the house of Ahab, eventually seized power in Judah after the death of her son Ahaziah. She attempted to destroy the royal family. For a terrifying moment, the Davidic dynasty appeared close to extinction. But one infant survived: Joash. He was hidden in the temple for years under the protection of Jehoiada the priest and Jehoshaphat. When Joash was old enough, Jehoiada organized a coup. The child king was crowned. Athaliah heard the noise and entered the temple complex. She saw the king standing by the pillar. She cried, "Treason!" She was removed and executed. The line of David survived. Joash began well under Jehoiada's influence. The temple was repaired. But after Jehoiada died, Joash listened to different advisors. Idolatry returned. Zechariah, son of Jehoiada, confronted the people. Joash ordered him killed. The king, who had been preserved through the courage of Jehoiada's household, eventually killed Jehoiada's son. The moral decline was severe. Joash himself was later assassinated. Judah's history continued through a mixture of faithfulness and compromise. Amaziah achieved victories, but later turned toward foreign gods. Uzziah became powerful and prosperous. He strengthened Jerusalem. He developed agriculture. His army became formidable. His fame spread. But success produced pride. Uzziah entered the temple and attempted to burn incense, a role reserved for priests. Priests confronted him. He became enraged. Then a skin disease appeared on his forehead. He lived isolated for the remainder of his reign while his son governed. Again, power did not place a king above the boundaries of covenant. Then came Jotham. After him came Ahaz. Under Ahaz, Judah entered one of its darkest royal periods. The international world was changing.
Assyria was rising into an empire of terrifying power. Its armies were disciplined, its campaigns were brutal, its kings demanded tribute and submission. Smaller kingdoms across the region now faced a choice: submit, form alliances, or risk destruction. Israel and Aram attempted to resist Assyria and pressured Judah to join their coalition. Ahaz refused. The kings of Israel and Aram then threatened Judah. Fear spread through Jerusalem. This was the setting in which the prophet Isaiah emerged prominently. Isaiah told Ahaz not to fear the two kings threatening him. Judah was called to trust the Lord. But Ahaz chose another solution. He appealed directly to Assyria. He sent tribute. He effectively invited the great empire into the regional conflict. Assyria responded. Aram's capital Damascus fell. But Judah's dependence on Assyria came at a price. Ahaz visited Damascus and saw a foreign altar that impressed him. He sent its design back to Jerusalem. A similar altar was constructed at the temple. The worship of Judah was reshaped under foreign influence. Ahaz also practiced severe forms of idolatry. The kingdom possessing the Temple of Solomon was not immune from the same spiritual corruption consuming the north. Meanwhile, Israel's final generations were approaching. After the house of Jehu weakened, kings were assassinated in rapid succession. Zechariah was killed by Shallum. Shallum reigned for only a month before Menahem killed him. Menahem kept power by paying enormous tribute to Assyria. The money was extracted from wealthy Israelites. For a time, payment purchased political survival, but tribute did not remove the threat. Pekahiah succeeded Menahem and was murdered by Pekah. Pekah joined Rezin of Aram in the anti-Assyrian coalition that threatened Judah. Then Assyria struck. Territories in northern Israel were captured. Populations were deported. The kingdom was being dismantled before its capital fell. Hoshea eventually became king. He submitted to Assyria and paid tribute. Then he sought support from Egypt and stopped paying. This was the final gamble. Assyria responded with overwhelming force. Samaria was besieged. The siege lasted years. Inside the capital, the northern kingdom faced the end of a history that had begun with Jeroboam centuries earlier. Prophets had warned Israel repeatedly. Elijah had confronted Ahab. Elisha had ministered through dynastic violence. Amos had condemned injustice and false security. Hosea had used the painful imagery of covenant unfaithfulness to describe Israel's relationship with God. The prophets did not merely announce that invasion was coming, they explained why. Israel's worship was corrupt. Its elites exploited the poor. Its courts could be unjust. Its people combined religious rituals with covenant violation. They trusted wealth. They trusted military alliances. They trusted foreign powers. They continued practices established at Bethel and Dan, and they assumed that national identity would protect them from consequences. Amos attacked that illusion directly. Being chosen did not mean being exempt from judgment. In fact, covenant privilege intensified covenant responsibility. Hosea described Israel as a spouse repeatedly abandoning a faithful covenant partner. His language combined anger, grief, judgment, and astonishing mercy. The northern kingdom's tragedy was not that it had received no warning. It was that warning had become part of everyday life and still failed to produce lasting repentance. Then Samaria fell. The northern kingdom of Israel ceased to exist as an independent political state. Its king disappeared from power. Its population was partially deported into territories controlled by Assyria. Other peoples were settled in the region. The political experiment begun by Jeroboam was over. The tribes associated with the northern kingdom did not simply vanish from history, despite later legends that often describe them as completely lost.
But their kingdom was destroyed. Its institutions collapsed. Its territory was absorbed into the Assyrian imperial system. The warning given at the birth of the divided kingdom had reached its end. Israel had fallen. But Judah remained. For the people in Jerusalem, the fall of the north should have been impossible to ignore. The ruins of Samaria stood as evidence that covenant judgment was not an empty threat. Would Judah learn? For a time, hope appeared under King Hezekiah. Hezekiah became one of Judah's major reforming kings. He removed high places. He destroyed sacred pillars. He cut down the Asherah. He even destroyed the bronze serpent that Moses had made centuries earlier because Israelites had begun burning incense to it. An object once associated with deliverance had become an idol. Hezekiah refused to preserve it merely because it carried ancient history. Reform meant confronting corruption, even when corruption hid behind religious tradition. Hezekiah also rebelled against Assyria.
That decision carried enormous risk. Assyria had already destroyed Samaria. Now, Sennacherib, one of its most powerful kings, invaded Judah.
Fortified cities fell. Lachish became a major Assyrian target. Eventually, the threat reached Jerusalem. The Assyrian representative stood outside the city and spoke in the language the people could understand. His message was psychological warfare. Do not trust Hezekiah. Do not trust Egypt. Do not trust the Lord. Had any god of any other nation stopped Assyria? Why should Jerusalem's God be different? The people on the wall listened. Hezekiah tore his clothes and went to the temple. Isaiah sent a word of reassurance. Jerusalem would not fall to Sennacherib. Hezekiah prayed. His prayer did not deny the Assyrian record. Yes, Assyria had destroyed nations. Yes, it had burned their gods. But those gods were objects made by human hands. Hezekiah asked for deliverance, so the kingdoms of the earth would know that the Lord alone was God. Then the Assyrian threat collapsed. The biblical account attributes the destruction of a massive portion of the Assyrian force to divine intervention. Sennacherib withdrew. Jerusalem survived. The same empire that had destroyed Samaria failed before Judah's capital. For the people of Jerusalem, the lesson could have been clear. Trust mattered. Reform mattered. God was able to deliver, but another danger now appeared. Success could be misunderstood. If Jerusalem had survived Assyria, perhaps the city was untouchable. Perhaps the temple guaranteed security. Perhaps Judah could repeat the northern kingdom's sins and still assume that David's city would never fall. That conclusion would be disastrous. Hezekiah eventually died. His son Manasseh came to the throne. Manasseh reversed much of his father's reform. High places returned, altars to Baal were rebuilt, Asherah worship reappeared, foreign celestial worship entered the temple courts. The king practiced forbidden forms of divination. The biblical record associates his reign with extraordinary evil and bloodshed. Judah had watched Israel fall. Then it chose many of the same paths. According to Kings, Manasseh's sins became a major reason judgment against Judah was eventually regarded as unavoidable. Later tradition, preserved in Chronicles, also describes a remarkable personal repentance by Manasseh after humiliation and captivity. But even if the king himself changed late in life, the national damage was not easily reversed. His son Ammon returned to evil practices and was assassinated. Then an 8-year-old boy became king, Josiah. Under Josiah, Judah would experience its last great reform. The temple was repaired. During that work, a book of the law was found. When its words were read to Josiah, the king tore his clothes. He realized how far Judah had moved from covenant obedience. Prophetic confirmation made the warning even more serious. Judgment was coming. But because Josiah humbled himself, the disaster would not occur in his own days. Josiah launched sweeping reforms. Idols were destroyed, corrupt worship sites were dismantled, the temple was purified.
The Passover was celebrated with extraordinary seriousness. And in a powerful act of historical reversal, Josiah extended reform northward into territories once associated with the fallen kingdom of Israel. At Bethel, he destroyed the altar linked to Jeroboam's original apostasy. Centuries after the northern kingdom's first king built that altar to protect his throne, a king from David's line tore it down. The warning spoken generations earlier had come full circle. For a moment, Judah looked renewed. But reform at the top could not completely erase generations of corruption. Then Josiah made a decision that ended his reign suddenly. Egyptian Pharaoh Necho was moving north toward conflict connected with the collapsing Assyrian world. Josiah confronted him at Megiddo. The battle was disastrous. Josiah was killed. Judah mourned. Jeremiah lamented. The kingdom lost its last major reforming king. And beyond Judah's borders, the political world was being transformed. Assyria, the empire that had destroyed Israel, was collapsing. But its fall did not mean freedom. Another empire was rising. Babylon. Under Nebuchadnezzar, Babylon would become the dominant power of the region. Judah was about to learn a terrible lesson. The empire that destroys your enemy does not automatically become your friend. After Josiah's death, Judah entered a rapid succession of vulnerable kings. Jehoahaz reigned only briefly before Pharaoh Necho removed him. Eliakim was placed on the throne and renamed Jehoiakim. Judah became trapped between Egypt and Babylon. When Babylon defeated Egypt at Carchemish, the balance of power changed dramatically. Nebuchadnezzar moved west. Judah came under Babylonian domination. Jehoiakim submitted. Then he rebelled. The pattern that had destroyed the northern kingdom was appearing again. Instead of sustained covenant reform, Judah placed hope in shifting political alliances. Jehoiakim died during the crisis. His son, Jehoiakim, became king. His reign lasted only a few months. Babylonian forces surrounded Jerusalem. Jehoiachin surrendered. He was taken into exile. Members of the royal family, officials, warriors, craftsmen, and other leading citizens were deported. Temple and palace treasures were taken. Jerusalem still stood. The temple still stood. But the kingdom had been wounded deeply. Nebuchadnezzar placed another son of Josiah on the throne and changed his name to Zedekiah. This would be Judah's final king. Zedekiah inherited a throne without true independence. Babylon held the real power. Jeremiah repeatedly warned against rebellion. His message was politically unpopular because he insisted that submission to Babylon was now part of surviving the judgment already underway. To many leaders, this sounded like treason. They wanted hope. They wanted promises of rapid restoration. They wanted prophets who would say Babylon's power would soon break. Jeremiah refused to give them what they wanted. He had spent years warning Judah that the true crisis was not simply military. It was covenantal. If the nation did not change, walls and temple would not save it. Yet Zedekiah eventually rebelled. The decision opened the final chapter. Nebuchadnezzar returned. Babylonian armies surrounded Jerusalem. The city was trapped. The kingdom had reached the point Israel had reached before Samaria fell. No more room for political maneuver. No new alliance strong enough to save it. No reform deep enough to undo generations of rebellion overnight. The northern kingdom had already fallen. Now the last surviving kingdom of Israel's ancient monarchy stood behind Jerusalem's walls, watching Babylon tighten its grip. The city of David was still standing. The Temple of Solomon was still standing. A descendant of David was still sitting on the throne, but all three were about to be tested at once. And this time, Jerusalem would not escape. The fall of Israel and the last days of Judah. Jerusalem was surrounded. The kingdom of Judah had reached the point where every earlier warning was converging into one final crisis. For generations, prophets had spoken. Kings had risen and fallen. Reforms had begun and been reversed. Foreign armies had come and gone. The northern kingdom of Israel had already been destroyed by Assyria. Samaria had fallen. Its people had been scattered across the empire. And now the last surviving kingdom descended from the nation of Israel stood trapped behind Jerusalem's walls. Babylon waited outside. Zedekiah sat on the throne, but his crown no longer represented true independence. Judah had become a small kingdom caught beneath the weight of an empire far larger than itself. The final catastrophe did not arrive suddenly. It had been approaching for years. To understand why Jerusalem now faced destruction, we have to see the last phase of Judah not as an isolated military defeat, but as the end of a long pattern. The kingdom had survived Assyria under Hezekiah. It had experienced reform under Josiah. It had possessed the temple. It had inherited the covenant tradition of Moses. It had carried the promise associated with David. But none of those privileges made rebellion harmless. The tragedy was not that Judah lacked warning. The tragedy was that warning had become so familiar that many no longer believed judgment would truly come. Jeremiah stood at the center of this final generation. His prophetic ministry stretched across the reigns of Judah's last kings. He watched the nation move from the reforms of Josiah to the disaster of Babylonian conquest. His message was not easy. He did not promise that Jerusalem could escape simply by performing more rituals. He did not tell Judah that possessing the temple guaranteed survival. In fact, one of his most famous confrontations occurred precisely because the people had begun treating the temple as a kind of protection against consequences. They could oppress, they could shed innocent blood. They could pursue other gods. Then they could enter the temple and assume they were safe. Jeremiah attacked that illusion. The temple was sacred. But the building itself could not be used as a shield for covenant rebellion. He pointed back to Shiloh, the earlier center of Israelite worship, where the tabernacle had once stood. Shiloh had not been immune from judgment. Neither was Jerusalem. This message struck directly at Judah's confidence. The people remembered how Jerusalem had survived Sennacherib. They remembered the Temple of Solomon. They remembered the Davidic dynasty. It was easy to transform those memories into a dangerous conclusion. This city cannot fall. Jeremiah said otherwise. That made him deeply unpopular. He was threatened. He was mocked. He was beaten. He was placed in confinement. At one point, a scroll containing his prophecies was read before King Jehoiakim. As sections were read, the king cut them with a knife and threw them into the fire. It was one of the most vivid images of Judah's final resistance to warning. The king could burn the scroll. He could not burn the reality the scroll described. Jeremiah dictated the message again. The words returned. The judgment remained. Meanwhile, the geopolitical world had shifted decisively. Assyria, once the dominant terror of the region, was collapsing. Nineveh fell. Egypt attempted to influence the power struggle. Babylon emerged as the great imperial force under Nebuchadnezzar. At Carchemish, Babylon defeated Egyptian power and gained control over much of the western region. Judah could no longer pretend that Babylon was a distant threat. Nebuchadnezzar's armies moved into the lands once contested by Assyria and Egypt. Jehoiakim submitted to Babylon for a time. Then he rebelled. That decision did not restore Judah's independence. It made further intervention almost inevitable. After Jehoiakim's death, his young son Jehoiakim inherited the throne. His reign lasted only a short time before Babylonian forces surrounded Jerusalem. The city surrendered. Jehoiakim was taken away. Members of the royal family went with him. Officials were deported. Warriors, craftsmen, and skilled workers were taken. temple treasures were removed. Among those carried into Babylon were people who would shape the religious memory of exile. Judah had not yet been completely destroyed, but Babylon had already begun dismantling its leadership. This deportation changed the nature of the kingdom. Jerusalem still had walls, the temple still functioned, the Davidic monarchy still appeared to continue. But many of the people capable of political, military, or economic resistance had been removed. Nebuchadnezzar installed Mattaniah, another son of Josiah, as king. His name was changed to Zedekiah. Names could carry political meaning. The Babylonian king was reminding Judah who now possessed the power to establish its ruler. Zedekiah was not king because Judah had won freedom. He was king because Babylon allowed him to rule. For a time, survival was still possible. Jeremiah's message became painfully practical. Submit to Babylon. Do not rebel. Accept the discipline that has come. Live through it. This was not the message Judah's political leaders wanted. National leaders often prefer prophets who promise victory. Jeremiah was telling them that surrender at this stage was wiser than resistance. Other prophets contradicted him. One of them, Hananiah, publicly declared that Babylon's power would soon be broken. He even took the wooden yoke Jeremiah wore as a symbolic message and broke it. The meaning was dramatic. Babylon's yoke would be shattered. Exiles would return quickly. Temple vessels would come back. The humiliation would soon end. Jeremiah initially walked away. Then he returned with another message. Hananiah had broken a wooden yoke. An iron yoke would replace it. False hope could not cancel the consequences already approaching. Jeremiah was not opposed to hope itself. In fact, some of the strongest promises of future restoration came through him. But biblical hope was not the same thing as denial. Judah wanted restoration without facing judgment. Jeremiah insisted that the nation had to pass through the consequences of its rebellion. To the exiles already living in Babylon, Jeremiah sent a message that would have sounded surprising. Build houses, plant gardens, marry, raise families, seek the welfare of the city where you have been sent. Do not listen to prophets promising an immediate return. The exile would not end in a few months. The people had to learn how to remain faithful even while living outside the land. This was a major transformation in Israel's history. For centuries, national identity had been tied closely to land, temple, monarchy, and tribal inheritance. Now, large numbers of Judeans were being forced to ask, how do we remain the people of God when we no longer control the land? How do we worship when Jerusalem is far away? How do we preserve the covenant when our political kingdom is disappearing? Those questions would become central after Jerusalem fell. But before that final fall, Judah made one last disastrous decision. Zedekiah rebelled against Babylon. The exact combination of political pressures behind the revolt involved the unstable balance among Babylon, Egypt, and local rulers. But the result was clear. Nebuchadnezzar came back. The Babylonian army surrounded Jerusalem. The siege began. A siege in the ancient world was a slow weapon. A city protected by walls could resist direct attack for a long time. But walls did not produce food. They did not create water beyond existing supplies. They did not cure disease. An army outside could wait while hunger weakened everyone inside. Jerusalem began to starve. The city that had once celebrated Solomon's abundance now faced famine. The royal capital of David's dynasty became a prison for its own inhabitants. Jeremiah continued speaking. Even now he urged surrender. Those who went out to the Babylonians could survive. Those who remained committed to resistance would face death. Officials accused Jeremiah of weakening the soldiers. To them, this was unacceptable during wartime. They wanted morale. Jeremiah kept announcing judgment. He was seized and lowered into a cistern. There was no water in it, only mud. Jeremiah sank down. A prophet who had warned the nation for years now sat trapped beneath the ground while the city above him moved toward destruction. His rescue came through Ebed-Melech, an Ethiopian official in the royal court. Ebed-Melech appealed to Zedekiah and argued that Jeremiah would die if left there. With permission, he gathered men and used cloth and ropes to lift the prophet from the cistern. The contrast is striking. Some of Judah's leaders wanted the prophet silenced. A foreign official acted to save his life. Jeremiah later promised that Ebed-Melech would survive the disaster because he had trusted the Lord. Zedekiah himself remained divided. He secretly consulted Jeremiah.
He seemed to fear the prophet's words,
But he also feared his officials. Jeremiah told him again that surrender could preserve his life and the city. Zedekiah could not bring himself to do it. The king had authority, but fear made him powerless. This is one of the final ironies of Judah's monarchy. Saul had feared the people. Rehoboam had tried to dominate them. Many kings had trusted alliances or idols. Now, Judah's last king feared those around him so deeply that he could not follow the course that might have reduced the catastrophe.
the siege tightened. At one point, Egyptian forces moved, and the Babylonians temporarily withdrew from Jerusalem. For those hoping Babylon would disappear, this may have seemed like vindication. Perhaps Egypt would save them after all. Perhaps Jeremiah had been wrong. Jeremiah said the opposite. Even if the Babylonian army appeared broken, the city would still fall. The temporary relief ended. Babylon returned. The famine worsened. The Book of Lamentations later preserved poetic memories of the horror surrounding Jerusalem's fall. The city, once full of people, became desolate. Hunger transformed ordinary life. The suffering became almost impossible to describe. People who had known security faced starvation. Parents watched children weaken. Social distinctions collapsed beneath the pressure. The city associated with divine presence was experiencing abandonment and grief. The prophets had often warned Israel that covenant rebellion would have real historical consequences. Now those consequences were no longer metaphorical. They were visible in empty streets, desperate households, and an enemy army beyond the wall. Eventually, the Babylonians breached Jerusalem's defenses. The wall was broken. The city that had resisted was opened to invasion. Zedekiah and his soldiers attempted to escape at night. They fled through a gate and moved toward the Jordan Valley. But Babylonian forces pursued them. The king was captured near Jericho. He was brought before Nebuchadnezzar at Riblah. What happened next ended the monarchy in a brutal and deliberate way. Zedekiah's sons were killed before his eyes. Then Zedekiah was blinded. The last thing Judah's final king saw was the death of his own heirs. Afterward, he was bound in chains and taken to Babylon. The Davidic throne in Jerusalem was empty. The dynasty had not necessarily ceased to exist biologically, but its reign as an independent monarchy had ended. Then came the destruction of the city. Nebuzaradan, commander of the Babylonian guard, entered Jerusalem. The temple was burned. Solomon's sanctuary, which had stood at the center of Judah's religious identity for centuries, was destroyed. The royal palace burned. The great houses of Jerusalem burned. The walls were broken down. Bronze objects from the temple were smashed and carried away. Sacred vessels disappeared into Babylonian possession. Priests and officials were taken. Some were executed. More people were deported. The city of David was devastated. The destruction must have seemed to overturn the entire national story. Abraham had been promised land. Now the people were being removed from it. Moses had established covenant worship. Now the temple lay in ruins.
David had received a promise concerning his dynasty. Now no son of David ruled in Jerusalem. Solomon had dedicated the temple in glory. Now smoke rose from its destruction. The Exodus had brought Israel out of a foreign empire. Now Israel's descendants were being carried into another empire. The historical arc appeared to have reversed itself. From slavery to freedom, from wilderness to land, from tribes to kingdom, from kingdom to temple, and now from temple to ashes, from throne to captivity, from land to exile. This was the great catastrophe toward which much of Kings and the prophets had been moving. But the Bible does not explain Jerusalem's fall as the simple result of Babylonian military superiority. Babylon was certainly powerful. Nebuchadnezzar possessed an empire, armies, siege technology, political organization, and regional dominance that Judah could not match. Yet the biblical writers repeatedly interpret the fall at another level. The kingdom collapsed because covenant unfaithfulness had accumulated across generations. Idolatry mattered, injustice mattered, violence mattered. The rejection of prophetic warning mattered, the abuse of power mattered, religious hypocrisy mattered. Foreign alliances had become substitutes for trust. Reform had repeatedly remained incomplete. Kings had assumed that political calculation could rescue a nation whose deeper foundations were breaking. The Babylonian conquest was the historical instrument, but the biblical interpretation was covenant judgment. This distinction is central to understanding Israel's history. Judah did not fall because God had suddenly become weaker than Babylon. The prophets presented Babylon itself as an instrument within judgment. The loss of the temple did not prove that Israel's God had been defeated by Babylonian gods. The shocking claim was almost the opposite. The God of Israel had allowed his own city and temple to fall, rather than allow the nation to treat covenant privilege as immunity. This was the same lesson already visible in the fall of Shiloh. The same lesson seen in the capture of the ark, the same lesson seen in the destruction of Samaria. Sacred history did not protect persistent rebellion. After Jerusalem fell, the Babylonians appointed Gedaliah to govern those who remained in the land. Not everyone was deported. Many poor people stayed behind. They received vineyards and fields. For a moment, a fragile form of life seemed possible under Babylonian authority. Jeremiah remained among them. He encouraged stability. Those who had fled to surrounding regions began returning. Perhaps even after national collapse, a small surviving community could remain in Judah. But violence had not finished its work. Ishmael, son of Nethaniah, a man of royal lineage, assassinated Gedaliah. The remaining community panicked. They feared Babylonian retaliation. Once again, they asked Jeremiah for guidance. They promised to obey whatever word came. Jeremiah told them not to flee to Egypt. Remain in the land. Do not fear Babylon. God would preserve them. But when the answer did not match what they wanted, they rejected it. They accused Jeremiah, and they went to Egypt anyway. They took Jeremiah with them. The history had turned full circle in a tragic way. Centuries earlier, God had brought Israel out of Egypt. Now, after the fall of Jerusalem, part of Judah voluntarily fled back there, despite prophetic warning. The Exodus generation had feared returning to Egypt. Now their descendants did exactly that. The kingdom was gone. The city was ruined. The temple was burned. The people were scattered among Babylon, Judah, Egypt, and other regions. From a political perspective, the nation created under Saul, unified under David, and glorified under Solomon had ended. Yet the exile did not erase Israel's identity. In Babylon, another prophetic voice was already active: Ezekiel. He had been among those deported before Jerusalem's final destruction. Far from the temple, near the Chebar Canal, Ezekiel received extraordinary visions. His ministry addressed a community learning to live with national catastrophe. Before Jerusalem fell, some exiles still hoped the disaster was temporary and that the city would remain secure. Ezekiel challenged those hopes. He described Judah's corruption with shocking imagery. He portrayed idolatry reaching even into the sacred spaces associated with the temple. Then, in one of the most dramatic theological visions of the exile, he saw the glory of the Lord depart from Jerusalem. The meaning was devastating. Judah had assumed that divine presence made the city untouchable. Ezekiel's vision presented the departure of that presence before destruction. The temple could fall because God was not trapped inside it, but Ezekiel's message did not end in destruction. After the fall of Jerusalem, the tone of his ministry increasingly opened toward restoration. Israel's leaders had failed. The people had been scattered like sheep, but God promised to seek his flock. A future shepherd would come. The scattered people could be gathered. A new heart and a new spirit were promised. In one unforgettable vision, Ezekiel stood in a valley filled with dry bones. The bones represented a people who believed their hope was gone. They were dead as a nation, cut off, finished. Ezekiel was asked whether the bones could live. Humanly speaking, the answer seemed obvious. No. Then the bones came together. Sinews and flesh appeared. Breath entered them. A vast living multitude stood where death had covered the valley. The vision was not a denial of exile. It was a declaration that exile would not have the final word. Another exilic voice appears in the book of Daniel. Daniel and other young Judeans had been taken to Babylon during an earlier deportation. They entered the world of imperial education and administration. Their Hebrew identity now had to survive inside the court of the empire that had conquered their homeland. Daniel's story showed another dimension of exile. Faithfulness was no longer simply about worshiping correctly in Jerusalem. There was no functioning temple there anymore. Faithfulness had to survive inside foreign government, foreign language, foreign pressure, and foreign power. Daniel and his companions were given Babylonian names. They were educated for service. They lived near the center of empire, yet the narratives associated with them repeatedly emphasize refusal to surrender ultimate allegiance. Daniel chose not to defile himself with royal food under the circumstances described in the book. His companions later refused to bow before Nebuchadnezzar's golden image. They were thrown into a furnace. They survived. Daniel interpreted royal dreams not through Babylonian wisdom, but by acknowledging God as the source of revelation. Nebuchadnezzar, the king who destroyed Jerusalem, appears in Daniel as a ruler whose pride could itself be humbled. The message was significant for exiles. Babylon looked absolute. Its walls were massive. Its king was powerful. Its gods seemed victorious. Its armies had destroyed Jerusalem. But Babylon was not ultimate. Empires rise, empires fall. The God worshipped by the exiles remained sovereign even outside the land. That realization changed what Israel could become in exile. Without monarchy, faith had to survive. Without national independence, covenant identity had to survive. Without the temple, prayer, memory, scripture, community, and hope became even more central. The exile forced Israel to confront the question that had been present since Abraham. Was the covenant dependent upon favorable circumstances? The story now answered through catastrophe. The nation could lose its land and still remember the promise. The temple could burn and prayer could continue. The king could disappear and the hope connected with David could remain. The people could live under foreign rulers without concluding that foreign gods had won. This does not make the fall of Jerusalem less tragic. The biblical writers never treat exile casually. Lamentations mourns, Jeremiah grieves, Kings ends in ruin. Ezekiel describes judgment in painful detail. The loss was real. A world had ended. But something else had become clear. The covenant story was larger than the political kingdom. That truth had already been visible when Abraham had no land, when Jacob lived in exile, when Joseph lived in Egypt, when Israel was enslaved, when the tabernacle moved through the wilderness. The presence of God had never depended entirely on one palace, one city, or one political state. And now, with all three lost, Israel had to rediscover that truth. Yet a question remained. What about the house of David? The monarchy was gone.
Zedekiah had been blinded and carried away. His sons had been killed. Jerusalem's throne was empty. Had the Davidic promise failed? The final lines of the Book of Kings offer a small but deliberate detail. Years after Jehoiachin had been taken to Babylon, a new Babylonian king released him from prison. Jehoiachin was treated kindly. His prison garments were changed. He was given a place of honor. He ate regularly at the king's table. This did not restore Judah. It did not rebuild Jerusalem. It did not reestablish the throne. But the biblical history does not end with the house of David erased. A descendant of David remained alive. The dynasty survived in exile. The political kingdom had fallen. The promise had not disappeared. And beyond Babylon, history was already moving again. The empire that had destroyed Jerusalem would not last forever. A new power would rise from the east. Babylon itself would fall. A foreign king would eventually authorize Judean exiles to return. The altar would be rebuilt. The temple would rise again. Jerusalem's walls would be restored. But the restored community would never simply return to the world of David and Solomon. Something had changed permanently. Israel had learned what monarchy could become. It had learned what unfaithfulness could cost. It had learned that the temple could be destroyed. It had learned that being chosen did not mean being beyond judgment. And it had learned through exile that judgment itself did not necessarily mean abandonment. That is the paradox at the center of Israel's fall. The nation lost nearly everything by which it had learned to recognize itself. Land, throne, temple, independence. Yet the story continued. The political kingdom ended. The covenant memory did not. The walls fell. The prophetic hope survived. The people were scattered. The promise remained. Israel's greatest national catastrophe had now happened. But the question opened at Abraham's calling had still not reached its final answer. If Israel had been chosen to become a blessing, what could that calling mean after such complete failure? If David's dynasty had received a promise, what could that promise mean without a king in Jerusalem? If covenant rebellion had led to exile, could there ever be restoration deep enough to solve the problem that produced exile in the first place? Those questions would define everything that came after the fall. Because Jerusalem's destruction was the end of a kingdom. It was not the end of Israel's story. Exile, restoration, and the legacy of Israel's fall. Jerusalem had fallen, the temple was burned, the throne was empty, the people were scattered. If Israel's story were only the story of a political kingdom, this would have been the end. But the history of Israel had never begun with a throne. It had begun with a promise. Long before David ruled in Jerusalem, Abraham had wandered through Canaan without possessing it. Long before Solomon built the temple, Jacob had slept beneath the open sky as a fugitive. Long before Israel had an army, Joseph had lived as a foreigner in Egypt. And long before the nation controlled a territory, God had already bound its identity to covenant. Now, after the collapse of everything Israel had built, that older foundation became more important than ever. The exile forced the people to ask questions they could no longer avoid. Why had this happened? Had Babylon defeated the God of Israel? Was the covenant over? Had the promise to Abraham failed? Had the promise to David failed? Could a people without a king, without a temple, and without political independence still be Israel?
The biblical answer did not minimize the catastrophe. The fall had been real. It had come through generations of rebellion, injustice, idolatry, pride, and refusal to listen. But judgment was not the same as annihilation. The prophets who announced destruction had also spoken of restoration. Jeremiah had warned that Babylon would dominate Judah, yet he also spoke of a future beyond exile. He described a time when God would make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. This future covenant would not merely reproduce the same outward structure. The law would be written on the heart. The relationship would become internal in a way the old pattern of repeated rebellion had failed to sustain. Ezekiel spoke in similar language. Israel needed more than another military victory, more than another king, more than rebuilt walls. The people needed a new heart. They needed a new spirit. The problem that had destroyed the kingdom had never been only Assyria or Babylon. The deeper problem had been within Israel itself. The nation had received law. It had received land. It had received leaders. It had received prophets. It had received repeated opportunities to return. Yet generation after generation had shown how easily covenant knowledge could coexist with covenant rebellion. If Israel's future depended only on rebuilding what had existed before, history could simply repeat itself. The restoration, therefore, had to become something deeper. But before that theological hope could unfold, political history changed again. Babylon did not last forever. The empire that had destroyed Jerusalem looked permanent while it was powerful. It was not. A new empire rose under the Persians. Cyrus became the dominant ruler of the region. Babylon fell. For the Judean exiles, this transformation altered everything. The book of Ezra records a decree associated with Cyrus permitting exiled peoples to return and restore their sanctuaries. The Judeans were allowed to go back to Jerusalem. The empire that conquered Babylon would not restore the Davidic kingdom, but it opened the door for the people to return to the land. Decades after deportation, families began the journey home. Imagine what that journey meant. Some returning exiles may have remembered Judah personally. Others had been born in Babylon. To them, Jerusalem was not a childhood memory. It was a story told by parents and grandparents. They had heard about the temple. They had heard about Zion. They had heard about the land. Now they were traveling toward ruins. The return was not a triumphant reversal of history in every sense. They were not returning as an independent empire. They did not have a Davidic king leading an army. They remained subjects of Persia. Jerusalem was damaged. The temple was gone. The surrounding region contained communities with their own interests and claims. Restoration began under limitation. That mattered. Israel was coming home. But Israel was not returning to the glory days of Solomon. Under leaders including Zerubbabel and Joshua the high priest, the returning community began rebuilding. The altar was restored. Sacrifices resumed. Then the foundation of a new temple was laid. The response was mixed. Some shouted with joy. Others wept. The older people who remembered Solomon's temple could see the difference. The sound of celebration and grief blended together. This is one of the most important emotional images of the Restoration era. The people were grateful, but they knew what had been lost. Restoration did not erase memory. Opposition then slowed the rebuilding effort. The work stopped for a time. Prophets such as Haggai and Zechariah challenged the community to continue. The temple was eventually completed. Worship returned to Jerusalem. But the Second Temple could not automatically recreate the political world that had disappeared. There was still no independent kingdom of David. There was still foreign rule. The promises remained larger than the visible restoration. Later Ezra came to Jerusalem with a strong concern for the law and covenant identity. The exile had taught Israel the cost of forgetting. Now scripture teaching and obedience took on renewed urgency. Ezra devoted himself to studying and teaching the law. The restored community faced difficult questions about identity, intermarriage, purity, and faithfulness in a world where Israel no longer possessed the political power of earlier centuries. Then Nehemiah arrived. He served in the Persian court before hearing about the condition of Jerusalem. The city's walls remained broken. Its gates had been burned. For an ancient city, ruined walls represented more than unattractive architecture. They represented vulnerability and humiliation. Nehemiah grieved. He prayed. Then he obtained authorization to return. Rebuilding the walls became a race against opposition. Local leaders mocked the project. Threats followed. Workers had to prepare for attack while continuing construction. Some worked with tools while remaining armed. Yet the walls were completed with remarkable speed. Jerusalem again became a fortified city. But Nehemiah understood something Israel's earlier kings had often forgotten. Strong walls could not protect a weak covenant community. After the construction, attention turned toward the people themselves. The law was read publicly. The people listened. They wept. They confessed. The covenant was renewed. Israel's restoration was being defined less by royal expansion and more by scripture worship, community discipline, and memory. This was a different kind of nation from the one David had ruled. The monarchy had once stood at the center. Now priests, scribes, elders, and local governors played larger roles. The temple again stood in Jerusalem, but foreign kings still controlled the wider political world. Persia would eventually give way to Greek power. Alexander the Great would reshape the ancient Near East. After his death, competing Hellenistic kingdoms would struggle over the region. Centuries later, Rome would dominate Judea. Israel had returned to the land. But the age of independent biblical monarchy had not simply resumed. This is why the fall of Jerusalem remained such a decisive turning point. It permanently changed the form of Israel's history. Before exile, the central question was often, would the kingdom obey? After exile, another question became equally urgent. How could Israel remain faithful under foreign rule while waiting for promises not yet fully realized? The prophetic books kept those promises alive. Isaiah spoke of restoration in language larger than mere political recovery. The exiles would be comforted. A way would open. The glory of the Lord would be revealed. A servant would emerge, whose mission involved both Israel and the nations. Jeremiah spoke of the new covenant. Ezekiel spoke of a new heart, a restored people, and a future shepherd. Zechariah spoke into the fragile post-exilic world with visions of purification, kingship, and future hope. Malachi confronted the restored community when even renewed worship began sliding toward routine and corruption. The prophets refused to let Israel conclude that returning from Babylon had solved every problem. The deeper story remained unfinished. This is where the complete history of Israel, from its origins to its fall, reveals one of its most important patterns. Every major achievement had exposed a deeper weakness. Abraham received a promise, but the family struggled. The Exodus brought freedom, but the wilderness exposed unbelief. The law gave Israel covenant structure, but the golden calf showed how quickly commandments could be broken. Joshua gave Israel military victories, but the incomplete conquest left paths toward compromise. The judges delivered the tribes, but none created permanent transformation. Saul gave Israel a monarchy, but his fear destroyed his kingship. David united the nation, but sin devastated his household. Solomon built the temple and expanded the kingdom, but his heart turned toward other gods. The divided kingdoms had prophets, but warning after warning was ignored. Hezekiah reformed Judah, yet his faithfulness could not guarantee the choices of his descendants. Josiah rediscovered the law, yet one generation of reform could not instantly undo centuries of corruption. The exile punished rebellion, but suffering itself could not automatically transform every heart. And the return rebuilt the temple, but it did not restore the lost monarchy or remove human sin. Each stage solved one problem while exposing another. That is why Israel's history is not merely a political rise and fall. It is a theological diagnosis. The story asks what happens when a people receive extraordinary privilege but remain human. Israel received revelation. Still it rebelled. Israel experienced miracles. Still it doubted. Israel possessed law. Still it violated justice. Israel received kings. Still power became corrupt. Israel had priests and sacrifices. Still worship could become empty. Israel had prophets. Still warning could be rejected. Israel had the temple. Still sacred space could be treated as protection for unholy lives. The Bible does not hide these failures because Israel's history was never meant to prove that the nation succeeded through human perfection. Its failures became part of the very story Scripture was telling. And yet, failure is only half of that story. The other half is preservation. Pharaoh tried to suppress Israel. Israel survived. The wilderness generation failed. The next generation entered Canaan. The judges' era collapsed morally. David's line emerged. Saul failed. The monarchy continued through David. David failed personally. The covenant promise continued. Solomon turned away. The kingdom divided, but Judah survived. Israel fell to Assyria. Judah remained for another century. Judah fell to Babylon. The exiles preserved their identity. The temple was destroyed. Another temple was built. The throne disappeared. The Davidic line did not disappear. Again and again, human structures collapsed, while some strand of the promise continued. This does not mean consequences were insignificant. Whole generations suffered because of decisions made before them. Cities were destroyed. Families were separated. People died in wars and sieges. The exile was not a symbolic inconvenience. It was national trauma. But Israel's story repeatedly refuses to let judgment become the final sentence. The reason reaches back to Abraham. God's original promise was not simply that Abraham would produce one powerful ancient nation. Through Abraham, blessing was ultimately meant to extend beyond Abraham's own family. Israel was chosen for a purpose larger than itself. That is why chosen nation must be understood carefully. Chosen did not mean morally superior. Israel's own scriptures provide too much evidence against that idea. Chosen did not mean immune from judgment. Assyria and Babylon proved otherwise. Chosen meant called into covenant, entrusted with revelation, given a role inside a larger divine purpose. Israel's election carried responsibility as well as privilege. The prophets repeatedly made this clear. Amos, speaking to the northern kingdom before its fall, turned Israel's sense of special status on its head. Because of the relationship Israel had received, its rebellion mattered profoundly. Privilege increased accountability. This is one reason the biblical history can speak so openly about Israel's sins. The writers were not attempting to construct national propaganda. A propaganda history would hide weak kings. It would minimize defeats. It would exaggerate righteousness. It would blame every catastrophe entirely on outsiders. Instead, the biblical story repeatedly turns inward. Why did the kingdom fall? Not merely because Assyria was strong, not merely because Babylon was stronger, because Israel's covenant life had collapsed. This self-criticism is one of the defining features of the biblical historical narrative. At the same time, Israel's enemies are not presented as morally perfect instruments. Assyria would itself face judgment. Babylon would fall. Empires could serve a purpose in one moment and face accountability in another. No earthly empire became the final kingdom. Egypt fell from dominance. Assyria rose and vanished. Babylon conquered Jerusalem and then lost Babylon. Persia rose. Greece followed. Rome followed later. Israel's political power repeatedly existed beneath or between much larger empires. Yet the small nation's scriptures continued to shape the way generations understood history, kingship, sacrifice, holiness, exile, hope, and redemption. This is where the story begins, moving toward the New Testament. That connection must be made carefully. Not every person or event in Israel's history was a direct prediction of Jesus. Not every battle was a hidden prophecy. Not every king was a symbolic code. But the larger themes created expectations that the New Testament later takes up directly. The promise to Abraham remained important. The Davidic covenant remained important. The failure of human kingship remained important. The prophetic hope for restoration remained important. The expectation of a Messiah, an anointed ruler, developed within Israel's scriptures and history. The hope for forgiveness, deeper than ritual reform, became important. The promise of a new covenant became important. The expectation of God's kingdom became important. By the 1st century, Judea lived under Roman power. The Second Temple stood in Jerusalem. Priests served. Pilgrims came to festivals. The scriptures were read. Different Jewish groups debated what faithfulness required. Some longed for liberation from foreign rule. Some emphasized rigorous obedience. Some expected divine intervention. Some looked for a royal Messiah. Others held more complex expectations. All of them lived in a world shaped by the long history we have followed. When the New Testament introduces Jesus, it does not begin an unrelated religious story. Matthew begins with genealogy: Abraham, David, exile. Those 3 reference points summarize enormous sections of Israel's history. Abraham represents promise. David represents kingship. Exile represents judgment and unresolved restoration. The genealogy itself tells the reader to understand this story, remember Israel. Jesus was born into the history of this people. He lived under Roman occupation. He worshipped within Israel's religious world. He quoted Israel's scriptures. He spoke about Abraham, Moses, David, the prophets, the temple covenant, kingdom, and exile-shaped hopes. The New Testament identifies him as Israel's Messiah and places his death and resurrection at the center of the fulfillment of the redemptive story. Again, this does not mean Israel's history was valuable only because it pointed forward. Its events had meaning in their own time. The Exodus mattered to the people who escaped slavery. The law mattered to the covenant community at Sinai. David's reign mattered politically and historically. The fall of Samaria and Jerusalem were genuine national catastrophes. The exile transformed real communities. Biblical theology does not require turning history into allegory. Instead, the later scriptures build on what those events already meant. The Exodus becomes a model of deliverance. Davidic kingship becomes part of messianic hope. Exile becomes part of the language of separation and restoration. Sacrifice becomes central to understanding atonement. The temple becomes part of a larger discussion of divine presence. The covenant becomes the framework within which the New Testament speaks of a new covenant. So what finally caused the fall of God's chosen nation? There is no single event, no single king, no single battle. Israel did not collapse because Rehoboam alone made one arrogant speech. It did not collapse only because Jeroboam built golden calves. It did not collapse only because Ahab married Jezebel. It did not collapse only because Manasseh promoted idolatry. It did not collapse only because Zedekiah rebelled against Babylon. Those were all important, but the fall was cumulative. Generation after generation added another layer.
political pride, idolatry, social injustice, abuse of authority, false worship, foreign dependence, rejection of correction, forgetting history, trusting institutions more than the covenant they represented. The exile did not begin when Babylon broke Jerusalem's wall. In a deeper sense, the road toward exile began whenever Israel repeatedly chose the benefits of covenant without the faithfulness covenant required. And yet the nation's collapse reveals something else just as important.
God's promise survived people who repeatedly failed to carry it faithfully. Abraham made mistakes. The promise continued. Jacob deceived. The promise continued. Joseph's brothers betrayed him. The family survived. The wilderness generation rebelled. Their children entered the land. Judges failed. David arose. David sinned. The dynasty continued. Solomon turned away. Judah remained. Judah fell. The exiles returned. The temple burned. Worship returned. The kingdom disappeared. The expectation of the kingdom survived. This is the paradox of Israel's history. Human failure is never minimized. Divine faithfulness is never made dependent upon human perfection. That does not remove responsibility. It explains why responsibility and mercy can appear side by side throughout the story. For modern readers, this history also warns against several misunderstandings. First, military success is not proof of spiritual faithfulness. Israel sometimes won while already drifting toward disaster. Second, religious institutions cannot substitute for obedience. The temple did not save Jerusalem when covenant life had become corrupt. Third, reform cannot remain superficial. Israel repeatedly removed symptoms while preserving deeper compromises. Fourth, strong leadership cannot solve every spiritual problem. Moses, Joshua, judges, kings, priests, and prophets all played vital roles. None could permanently transform the human heart. Fifth, being part of a sacred history does not place a community beyond accountability. Israel's election brought responsibility, and finally, judgment does not automatically erase hope. Jerusalem fell, but Scripture continued. The people were exiled, but communities survived. The throne disappeared, but Davidic expectation remained. The temple burned, but the second temple rose. Babylon conquered, then Babylon fell. From the perspective of the ancient world, Israel's survival is one of the remarkable features of this history. Many kingdoms of similar size disappeared into the imperial systems that conquered them. Israel and Judah suffered conquest, deportation, political collapse, and foreign domination. Yet the identity of the people and their scriptures endured. The story continued to be told. Children continued to learn Abraham's name. Passover continued to remember the Exodus. The law continued to be studied. Jerusalem continued to matter. The Psalms continued to be prayed. The prophets continued to be read. The catastrophe was preserved rather than erased from national memory. Israel remembered its own failure, and by remembering, later generations could ask what that failure meant. The answer was never simply, "Our enemies were stronger." The biblical answer was more demanding. A nation can possess sacred history and still lose its way. A king can possess wisdom and still become unfaithful. A temple can stand while injustice grows around it. A people can hear prophets and refuse to listen. A covenant can be known intellectually while being abandoned practically. The history of Israel is therefore not only a chronology of patriarchs, battles, kings, and empires. It is the story of a promise carried through human instability. It begins with one man leaving Haran. It moves through a barren couple waiting for a son. It becomes a family. The family goes to Egypt. The family becomes enslaved. Slaves become a covenant nation. A wilderness generation dies. Their children cross the Jordan. Tribes settle the land. Judges rise and fall. A monarchy begins. David unites the kingdom. Solomon builds the temple. The kingdom divides. Prophets warn. Israel falls. Judah survives. Judah rebels. Jerusalem burns. Exiles mourn. Then, beyond the ashes, the promise continues. That is the history behind the phrase, God's chosen nation. Chosen yet accountable, blessed yet often rebellious, judged yet not forgotten, broken yet preserved.
Israel's national kingdom fell because covenant privilege could not protect covenant unfaithfulness forever. But its fall did not erase the larger story. The land had been lost before and recovered. The temple had been destroyed and rebuilt. Empires had appeared invincible and then vanished. Through every reversal, the promise kept moving forward, from Abraham to Isaac, from Isaac to Jacob, from Jacob to the tribes, from slavery to Exodus, from Sinai to Canaan, from judges to kings, from David to exile, from exile to restoration, and from Israel's unresolved hopes into the world of the New Testament. The nation fell, but the story did not. The throne became empty, but the promise of a king remained. The temple turned to ashes, but the hope of God dwelling with his people survived. The people entered exile, but covenant memory crossed the borders with them. Israel's greatest political chapter ended in destruction, yet the very scriptures that record that destruction insist that history was still moving toward restoration. The kingdom fell. The promise continued.